Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Chairperson Lubabalo here. From the Select Committee on Appropriations Chair, there are no apologies. Thank you.
Thank you. Darren, any apologies from your side?
Good morning,
Before you go there, Chairperson, before you go to Darren, I'm sorry,
Yes.
I haven't communicated to Lubabalo. Sometime during the meeting, I'll have to sneak out and go to a doctor.
That's fine.
Thank you.
That's fine, Uruma. Hope you'll feel better. Darren?
Chairperson, good morning. On behalf of Standing Committee on Appropriations, we received apologies from Ms. Ntlangwini and Ms. Digale. Ms. Peters is in the meeting, but she indicated that she will have to leave the meeting a little bit earlier. That's it, Chairperson.
And Mr. Nkwankwa, it's also.
I haven't received an apology from Mr. Nkwankwa.
Yeah, no, he communicated with me.
Okay.
And again that was on Wednesday. I forgot to mention that. You remember they have got a bereavement.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So please remember to note those apologies. Lubabalo, can you please fly to the agenda? Yes. Honorable members, we are going to be strict with time because we are meeting to have public hearings on the second adjustment appropriation bill and on the 2020 medium-term budget policy statement. As you can see, agenda item number 3 will be having public service accountability monitor and the C19 People's Coalition. So what we intend doing is that maximum 15-15, and then we deliberate for about 30 minutes so that we can excuse them and then start with the second batch of hearings. You are all welcome, honorable members. The organizations who are going to be making presentations, you are all welcome. Thank you very much for availing yourself to share with us your views on what we are doing. And I'll definitely be requesting that we stick to time so that we are able to accommodate everybody. Honorable members, with those few words, allow me to ask Public Service Accountability to take us through their presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. Just to note very briefly that we hope to also submit an updated version of both this presentation with minor adjustments as well as our full submission. So there may be some slight differences, but not substantial. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Zugiswa Kota from the Public Service Accountability Monitor in Makhanda. Just a very brief outline of the presentation. Sorry, I must just be sure that I'm timing myself. Next slide, please. Yeah, just very briefly, the Public Service Accountability Monitor is based in Makhanda, and we work in 6 African countries looking at issues within public resource management and recognizing essentially the need to have systemic reforms and deepening institutional and systemic reforms to realize human rights. Thank you. One of the areas of concern for us is very much around fiscal governance and financial integrity. And I thought to just touch on this before proceeding with our presentation. And I'll read the quote verbatim. Financial integrity requires a whole system, a whole ecosystem, economic and financial institutions, social norms and governance arrangements supported by policymakers, public officials, businesses of all sizes, civil society, households, and the public at large. All segments of society need to feel invested in equality, fairness, and accountability. The issues are systemic. Systemic solutions are needed. And this is taken out of a high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity, which is driven at achieving Agenda 21. We'll refer to it again later, and perhaps would be interested to see if the committee would be interested in reading the report further. Thank you. Just broadly in terms of the context that we paint, I think many on this call and many of my colleagues who will be speaking today will likely speak to these items. But perhaps what we wanted to really reiterate in our presentation today relates to what COVID-19 has done for exacerbating public service issues, and in particular placing pressure on public financial management systems, which I know the committees today are well aware of. We also are concerned about the curtailing of abilities of citizens to exert accountability and oversight in various ways. Another area is that it has exposed previous and ongoing corruption. The AG's reports, for instance, and many SIU investigations have shown that. But in particular, there are questions about why health systems and the public service are either underprepared or too weak to address issues of the pandemic. Perhaps just to highlight why it is for us this space is important, it is that we feel in addition to strengthening transparency, accountability, and public participation to combat the misuse of funds, there is also an opportunity to ensure that weaknesses in key planning, budgeting, and oversight systems are addressed, but also are addressed by using open government interventions, which we hope to touch on today. Lastly, we really call on the committee to exert their influence on members of the executive, not only to acknowledge the need to build back better, but to meet this commitment with real financing and policy making. Thank you. So, yeah, perhaps I'll skip ahead and go right into the presentation. So let's skip that slide, Darren, thank you. So delving right into it, I think many on the call will be speaking about the South African Airways Rescue Plan. And like many SOEs that are currently in trouble, we are aware that a total of 10.5 billion rand will be allocated for what is called a business rescue plan for SAA. What is of concern is that this will be funded primarily through reductions to baselines of national departments and public entities, as well as, and I think this is underscored in our longer submission, provincial and local government conditional grants, which is for us a fundamental concern. What we recommend in relation to this is that, well, firstly, the observation that the consequences of poorly run and unaccountable SOEs continue to have a dire impact on the delivery of services in South Africa. But we are alarmed, and I think what we are stating in our submission, on the one hand, is that there are many economic analyses and models that have indicated the issues and have presented alternatives. What we present today is not so much more of that, but in fact to underscore our alarm that despite years of evidence as a loss-making enterprise, our cabinet still seeks approval for this kind of bailout. And so what we are calling for is that in addition to analyzing the very real opportunity costs, which are important, it's also an opportunity, and we really feel that, in fact, while these are committees on appropriations, it is also an opportunity for committees of Parliament to compel the National Treasury and Cabinet to interrogate the political and administrative environment or the factors that enable such short-sightedness, and for them to proffer tangible solutions. And so what we are really insisting on in this instance is that it also is about the underlying systemic issues and political context in which these issues are enabled. Thank you. I think we've reiterated this many times, so I'll skip this slide, but really just it outlines the 10 highest reductions in order to feed into the rescue plan. So the one area that we are concerned about is the budget cuts that are affected to the South African Revenue Services. And for us, that is, of course, also connected to anti-corruption interventions. The ANE outlines a 238 million decrease in budget allocation for SARS. There is detail in our longer submission, but in essence, what we recommend, in addition to some of the more explicit findings or explicit recommendations about anti-corruption interventions, that in order to address illicit financial flows, which have been shown to have a direct impact on the public service and a direct impact on the bottom line of what the state should be able to do, there's a need to reverse budget cuts to SARS and to significantly increase its resources. The second recommendation here, and we had a moment just before this call with a colleague about, there's a verbatim, essentially, emphasis on this particular point, and I think it does speak to the importance of SARS, which is to say that in order to safeguard the strength and the integrity of South Africa's tax administration, there's a fundamental need to ensure that there's investment within SARS. Lastly, we reiterate calls by the AG recently that government departments need to design and implement controls that prevent fraud and errors and abuse as a means of avoiding dire costs in the long term. And so again, speaking to the issue of long-term costs, but also of systemic reform, which will not be possible if there are further budget cuts to an entity like SARS. Thank you. I think we can skip that slide and discuss it in detail later. Here, again, in our submission, our detailed submission, we also outline some fundamental issues of transparency and openness. And the committee may well ask why it is we bring issues of transparency and openness to a committee on appropriations. But in fact, we do feel that there is room and a need for the National Treasury and provincial treasuries to deepen transparency in order to strengthen and support oversight. We find that the pandemic has obliged departments to channel significant funds towards curbing the virus. That's well noted. But what we also note is that there are historical trends, particularly at the provincial level, of slow and or non-disclosure of key financial information. And this has the impact of heightening barriers for monitoring by people like ourselves and organizations in provinces, but also of important oversight entities such as legislatures and committees of parliament. So we also would then urge that provincial departments, and this is for us an important area for intervention by committees like Appropriations, that they must be urged, provincial departments in particular, and national departments as well, to proactively publish key data such as in-year expenditure reports. So to give an anecdotal example, in preparing for some of the analysis for our submission, it was rather difficult to, on the one hand, have a retrospective look at what's happening at the provincial level, and also to find in-year reports in order to come up with an accurate or more accurate picture of the status of funding. Provincial legislatures and portfolio committees must also fulfill their obligations by ensuring that health officials and departments, as well as provincial treasury, remedy these deficiencies in a sustained manner. And so it's not just about every now and then information being available on websites and through various platforms, but that actually it is an ongoing availability question. Thank you. Next slide. Okay. In relation to budget cuts to Stats SA, in our longer submission, there is quite, I think many might feel quite an emotive statement, but really, again, we note the allocations to Stats SA that have been cut, and I'll speak to my own slides just because there's a typo, apologies for that in this one. But that Stats SA's budget was also reduced, on the one hand by 45 million in order to fund SAA, and in addition to that, there are cuts to the personnel line items of Statistics South Africa. To rush ahead to our recommendations, essentially, we note on the one hand that there is no question that the collection of regular and credible statistical data is an integral component of building state capacity. And a functional statistical agency is really at the center of delivering well-targeted public services. And I would ask, both colleagues and members of the committee to have a look at the very emotive but also very insightful piece by the Statistical Council, in which they outline that Stats SA cannot produce accurate data if there are further budget cuts. Next slide. We'll skip that one as well and to the next one. Thank you. I'm just noting my time. In relation to zero-based budgeting, the Minister announced that there is a plan to pilot this in the via the Department of Public Enterprises and through National Treasury in 2021, and to fully integrate it into Budget 2023. We make a few points on this. On the first hand, that zero-based budgeting has been shown to have some advantages and a multitude of potential disadvantages. So we would call on the National Treasury on the one hand to make efforts to ensure that the process is one that is adequately participatory and transparent, but also that the needs or the demands of zero-based budgeting, in addition to identifying best measures, meet institutional capacity gaps. So one of the issues relating to zero-based budgeting that's been raised is that it's very expensive. It is also very time-consuming, and at present, I think we are all very aware of the public service and its constraints in terms of human resourcing and capacity. We also then feel, lastly, that there's a need to entrench either way, regardless of whether or not we go the zero-based budgeting route, to entrench effective financial management and to eliminate wasteful expenditure, especially in provincial departments and SOEs. So thank you. And in conclusion, I see well within time, the AG's office established during the COVID-19 context partnerships with civil society and community groups to contribute to real-time COVID-19 monitoring. The PSAM calls for deepening of this kind of partnership of this nature and for more direct engagement of communities in a sustained manner. We reiterate the former AG's call to role players within the state to undertake a shift in thinking towards prevention. And he specifically said that designing and implementing controls that prevent fraud, errors, and abuse are an investment that pays off when an institution is called upon to deal with crises as we are now experiencing. It is by far a better approach than having to deal with lengthy and costly investigations, context we are facing, and a loss of resources, as well as a loss of public confidence. Even in the midst of a crisis, transparency and accountability for government spending to the benefit of citizens, should be a priority and cannot take a back seat. And perhaps to just reiterate, given our time constraints, we would really ask the committee to have a close look at what we list in terms of recommendations to combat illicit financial flows, but also specifically recommendations about how best to entrench responses to systemic reform in order to ensure a better use of public resources. Thank you.
Jay.
C19, sorry, I was. Thank you, Zugiso. Can everybody else mute 19?
Good morning, Chair and honourable members. I am Dr. Nimi Hoffman, and I'm making a submission on behalf of the C19 People's Coalition. Thank you very much for your time today. The People's Coalition is an alliance of 379 social movements, trade unions, community organizations, and NGOs united by the program of action we've all endorsed. Next slide, please. Members, next slide, please. Members, 2 weeks ago, we presented on the Division of Revenue Bill. We argued that it hollows out state capacity at provincial and municipal levels, with worrying implications for people's lived experience of democracy. We showed how the planned wage cuts at provincial level are focused on sectors such as learning and culture, which are overwhelmingly staffed by Black women. These wage cuts represent a form of economic violence against Black women and will disproportionately harm children in township and rural schools. In this presentation, we show how the A&E hollows out national institutions, undermines the social compact, and enables a growth in illicit financial flows by weakening tax administration. Next slide, please. As such, we therefore recommend the following. First, that illicit financial outflows are addressed by reversing budget cuts to SARS and significantly increasing its resources. Allocating sufficient budget to strengthen the country's tax administration is an investment in the long-term financial stability of the country and a non-negotiable component of prudent fiscal policy. Second, deprioritize spending on defense in order to free up funds for deepening social policy and strengthening public administration. Third, reducing the use of consultants and outsourced services while consolidating and investing in a dedicated professional civil service. Fourth, reversing cuts to the education cluster and reclassifying basic education as a frontline service. Fifth, reversing cuts to healthcare, removing medical aid tax credits, and prioritizing resources for implementing the NHI. Next slide, please. Sixth, provide adequate budgets for community healthcare worker compensation as legally agreed upon in 2016. Seventh, initiating a formal inquiry into which conditional grants have been subject to delays in payment and what the reasons for delays are. Furthermore, extending the SRD grant and caregivers allowance until the end of the financial year, broadening eligibility and increasing the amount in order to stave off mass hunger and stimulate economic growth. This will allow government to work towards implementing a basic income grant. And then finally, Oliver Tambo District Municipality has been hit by a tornado and nearly 400 people have been left homeless. Disaster relief measures in line with the attendant budgetary processes must be effected. Next slide, please. Looking at wage bill cuts, 10 billion rand has been cut from the national wage bill and 25 billion from the provincial wage bill. Next slide, please. This is a kick in the teeth of frontline public servants. When the wage bill savings do not materialize, we are concerned that Treasury will come looking to cut spending on social policy measures for the most vulnerable of our people. At the same time, the budget for the CCMA has been cut by 90 million. The CCMA has indefinitely extended a ban on walk-in referrals and reduced the use of its commissioners. This undermines one of the few institutions of recourse available to vulnerable workers, and as business commentators have noted with alarm, is effectively dismantling an institution which has saved businesses and the economy much time and money. This forces labor in both the public and private sector to carry the consequences of elites' financial mismanagement. It is not compatible with the requirements of a social compact. We reject this unjust and unsustainable response. Instead, government must reduce illicit financial flows, cut state looting by the private sector, and reduce wasteful expenditure. This will require strengthening state capacity and building institutions for rigorous public participation and oversight, as my colleague at PSAM has so clearly and convincingly argued. Next slide, please. Turning now to illicit financial flows. Tax revenue is expected to be 313 billion rand less than the February 2020 forecast. This is a serious revenue gap, but it's not only a direct consequence of the sharp economic contraction. It's also a result of increasing illicit financial flows. SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter has called attention to concerning levels of offshore transfers of South African funds in the form of base erosion and profit shifting, together with increased trade misinvoicing. Yet, SARS will receive 238 million rand less in its budget allocation this year. Although SARS has said it needs more money, not less money, in order to address its capacity gaps. As Parliament's Finance Committee has been told, there are 800 critical vacancies in SARS. If these vacancies are not filled with competent and highly skilled individuals, the capacity of the state to aggressively reduce illicit financial flows and grow the tax base will be further weakened. So it is incredibly important to strengthen the country's tax administration with appropriate budget allocations. It's important for the financial stability of the country. It's important for prudent fiscal policy. And it's also necessary if South Africa is to honor its commitments to reduce international financial flows as outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. Turning now to basic education. Government has deprioritized basic education funding for years. When taking into account inflation, the total spend on education has declined year on year for the last 4 years. This year, the country was faced with the global pandemic, and the schooling sector required careful central planning and increased resources in order to address long-standing water infrastructure backlogs, insufficient textbooks and teachers, and in order to reduce the risk of COVID-19 transmission in schools. At the same time, it needed to strengthen the school nutrition program in the face of widespread and growing hunger. Yet, instead of increasing the budget, Treasury made the decision to cut the budget yet again by 1.9 billion. This is because the government did not deem basic education to be a frontline department, despite the fact that for much of the day it is home to almost 11 million children and 433,000 teachers, and is therefore a key site for public health. The National DBE has responded to successive budget cuts in part by freezing posts and placing staff on short-term precarious contracts. The result is that the department is understaffed and demoralized. Within this context, it's especially worrying that consulting services have increased by 11.4% and are projected to almost double by 2020. At the same time, the use of agency staff is expected to increase by a factor of almost 2.5. Cutting the budget while increasing reliance on external services is gravely irresponsible. It erodes the institutional memory and capacity vital to sound public administration. In doing so, it further weakens the department's demonstrably weak hold on provincial administrations and its ability to ensure efficient spend. We call on the Joint Appropriations Committee to reverse these budget cuts, reclassify basic education as a frontline department in the fight against COVID-19, and dramatically reduce consulting services in order to safeguard institutional capacity and autonomy. Next slide, please. Turning to healthcare, COVID-19 has demonstrated the ways in which a segregated system of public and private health is both unjust and inefficient. We urgently need to create a single national universal healthcare system in order to ensure an effective, efficient, and just healthcare system. Yet more than 319 million rand has been cut from systems health strengthening required to implement the NHI. At the same time, the system of medical aid tax credits has continued unabated. This is an annual subsidy of more than 20 billion rand to the middle classes. We call on the Joint Appropriations Committee to reverse these cuts, halt medical tax credits, and commit the resources required to implement the NHI. Furthermore, community health workers have been central in dealing with emergencies such as COVID-19, HIV, and tuberculosis. Most community health workers are Black women, and this frontline burden rests on them. We call for the provision of adequate budgets for the compensation of community health workers as legally agreed upon in 2016. This is non-negotiable. They are central to delivering high-quality universal health care for our people. Next slide, please. Turning now to social development. The poverty and inequality in our society is directly related to the dispossessions inflicted by slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, which persists today through the continued exploitation of Black people. Black women in particular have faced some of the heaviest burdens of structural inequality. This can be seen through lower labor market participation, higher unemployment, lower wages, overrepresentation in precarity, and higher burdens of care work. Social spending is not charity. It is necessary for reducing inequality, improving economic growth, and ensuring all our people live a dignified life. We therefore call for government to extend the SRD grant and caregivers allowance until the end of the financial year, broaden eligibility, and increase the amount in order to stave off mass hunger and stimulate growth. This lays the foundations for a basic income grant that is universal, unconditional, and redistributive, and can be financed in part through progressive taxation on both income and wealth. Next slide, please. The details of that can be found on this slide. Next slide, please. So summing up, we believe that the AENE represents all the wrong priorities. It represents a 9.8 billion rand cut in wage bills, at the same time as there are plans to double the spend on consultants and external services in some departments. It represents a 1.8 billion rand gift to the defense sector, at the same time as there are large cuts to key social programs in education, science and technology, health, land reform, public works and infrastructure, while 20 billion rand in medical tax credit subsidies to the middle class continue unabated. It represents 238 million rand in cuts to SARS, 100 million rand in cuts to Stats SA, and 90 million rand in cuts to the CCMA. All of this hollows out institutional capacity and undermines our state's autonomy, leaving it vulnerable to undue influence by donor agencies, consultants, and private interests. It weakens the social compact our country needs in order to survive this period. Budget cuts are therefore not solely a function of reduced national revenue. They also reflect a political program of investing in guns over schools and subsidizing the middle class at the expense of rural and working class families. This political program prioritizes outsourced services over the development of dedicated and professionalized civil servants, and weakens the institutions required to improve revenue collection and public administration. Next slide, please. Instead, we want to see that government addresses illicit financial flows and corruption, that it implements a more progressive system of taxation on incomes and wealth, that it strengthens state institutions and reduces the use of consultants, that it reverses years of cuts to basic education funding and establishes a single national healthcare system for all of us, that it moves to a guaranteed universal income, that it provides land for housing and food production, that it addresses the crisis of water and sanitation, and that it undertakes a just transition from greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. To end this presentation, we are requesting a greater deal of democratic accountability from this committee and from Treasury. We would like a written and oral response from National Treasury on the recommendations in the submission, and for these responses to be made public. We do not only want a response regarding expenditure, but also a response regarding revenue issues, including ongoing medical aid tax credits, progressive taxation, and illicit financial flows. Treasury has in the past avoided being accountable to public scrutiny by claiming that such revenue questions are inappropriate since tax policy proposals are dealt with in February. But we do not want to wait until after Treasury makes decisions that are fait accompli and cannot be altered in any way. This is a futile exercise in rubber stamping and is anti-democratic. We also note that members may want to question us about which trade-offs we want to see. This is passing the buck. Members must instead conduct the rigorous oversight required to address the billions not being spent in line with supply chain management practices before asking civil society which of people's basic human rights should be weighed up against each other and sacrificed. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman. Can you, I think where we are now, oral members, allow oral members, you can see that we don't have a lot of time. If you could just be disciplined, limit ourselves to 2 minutes per honorable member as we pose questions both to Public Service Accountability Monitor and to C19 People's Coalition, right? And please show your hands in the screen, in the screen, and then you'll help me, Lubabalo, to identify the members who would like to interact with the presentation. Let's see. I see. Okay, I see Honorable Joseph Matafa.
Honorable Muletsane, Chair.
Muletsane.
Honorable Ryder.
Honorable Ryder.
Let me quickly check in the chat box, Chairperson. No, okay. Those are the names so far, Chair.
Honorable,
Honorable Karim.
Honorable Karim, yes. Anybody else? Because after this I close, and members, anybody else? Or members, anybody else? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Closed. Let's start with Honorable Joseph. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, all, and thank you for the presentations. I read through the presentations yesterday, and I think there was just one point that I wanted to raise on with Dr. Hoffman. In that presentation there was a lack of public participation. I found that concerning. I was not sure what they mean, because I think from Parliament side we are really trying to allow all organizations to give input into the budgets as far as we can, but within our processes. I support the point about money, too much money still being spent on consultants and maybe also litigation. We must find out how much money do the department spend on litigation. I support the 1.8 billion on defense, and it's a strong statement to say it's guns over schools, Chairperson. A very strong statement, and I support some of the recommendations. Ms. Kota, I just wanted to ask her, what is your view on the South African government's fiscal governance and financial integrity, as you have called it? Because government is transparent, government is accountable, even on poor performance. Even our record is not good. At least government is unlike in apartheid government. This government is open and transparent. So I would like you, what measurement do you use against the government? Points do you, or beacons or targets do you use to measure the government in terms of fiscal governance and financial integrity? I find your comments on SAA very interesting. It's rather recommendations than, sorry, it's rather findings.
30 seconds.
Yeah, it's rather findings than recommendations on SA rescue plan. And then the last point, I find the zero-based budget interesting. It's important that public organizations keep it on the agenda for government and monitor what is our view and our take on and a process on zero-based budgeting. I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Honorable Joseph. Honorable Matafa.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to yourself, honorable members, and our guests. Chairperson, I'm going to be very brief, and maybe Honorable Joseph should have known and taken my time. I just want to pick just on 2 issues. The first one is to agree with PSAM on the prevention of illicit financial flows. I think since we are sitting in a situation where the budget cuts are inevitable, it's important that maybe the committee considers this input, as also raised by People's Coalition, to ensure that we strengthen SARS in this area of illicit financial flows. Maybe it's a request that we can put forward to Treasury as well as a committee, and to ensure that we, on a regular basis, we get a report to indicate what efforts are being put in place to ensure that they are able to increase their capability to detect, prevent, and deal with such developments. And the second one, Chair, it's almost similar to what Honorable Joseph raised when he speaks to the submission by PSAM in terms of transparency and openness by provincial legislatures in particular. with my background coming from a municipality, I know that on a quarterly basis, there are reports like those that fall under Section 52 and 72 of the MFMA, which details the work, the work of government as it comes to the budget implementation. Are there other initiatives that they can recommend to the committee to take forward to the provincial transparency and accountability processes? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Matafa. Honorable Letsane.
Thank you, Chair. On C19 People's Coalition, on their submission, there's a recommendation that there should be an inquiry into the delays of conditional grant transfers. I would like to know, have the coalition tried to investigate some of the reasons behind the delays in the conditional grant transfers, since the modalities of transferring conditional grants depends on the grant framework, and some delays emanate from the non-compliance by receiving accounting officers. Secondly, according to C19 People's Coalition, what are immediate interventions that can be put in place to assist the district given that the MTBPS has already been tabled and the process takes time to be concluded, and those affected families need urgent attention? What has C19 People's Coalition doing using its own resources to also assist the destitute families in the OR Tambo? Lastly, according to C19 People's Coalition, what will be best option or alternative that can be proposed for government apart from wage bill? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Honorable Muletsane. Honorable Ryder.
Yes, good morning, Chair, colleagues, and thank you to the presenters. Ms. Kota, I enjoyed your presentation, cogently put together and well presented. Thank you. And I think C19 also spoke about illicit flows, and it's something that's been picked up consistently, and obviously pointing to the fact that perhaps some of the wrong budget cuts are being made. Chair, and this is perhaps an observation more than a question. It's just a case of, I want to know the effectiveness of our existing systems for combating corruption and illicit flows. How well is it working? So, we're worried about taking money away from entities, but the question is, are the entities that we have working effectively and working together? And things like, example, the FRC, which is supposed to pick up a bunch of funny transactions and report them through. I'd like to just hear, perhaps from Treasury, the effectiveness of these systems that are in place in order to pick up the corruption and the illicit flows. And I'm focusing particularly on the FRC because I'm not seeing a lot of a benefit coming out of the large expense that goes into the FRC. And, especially if one looks at the Zondo Commission and the details coming out of that, why has the FRC not raised some red flags? If they have, where's the the convictions that are related to that? Then on C19, I just want to pick up an anomaly in your presentation and question it. You've been moaning. You've been moaning the increase to defence, and you spoke about a gift to defence, which I think is more a case of refunding them for the work that they did in terms of COVID-19. But the question is, many of the impoverished people on the ground complain about our border controls and the fact that there are too many illegal aliens in the country, and defence is tasked with fixing this. Now, this is an issue that you've highlighted as a problem, is the fact that you're trying to protect the poorest of the poor. They're the ones that are saying they need more from defence. So I just want to question your thinking on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Ryder. Honorable Karim.
Thank you, Chairperson. We've said this before, and perhaps because there are other stakeholders here now, we should say it again. But I think broadly we agree with the principles and values that underlie what the civil society actors say. The issue, though, is to have trade-offs. And this is an appropriations bill. More than ever, we need more help from civil society on what they think we should do precisely. Where do we take the money from? What's the rationale for doing so? Where do we put it and why, and so on? And I know that they don't have the technical expertise that Treasury has, and to some extent Parliament has, but we would appreciate that. Secondly, I think on the illicit financial flows, Chairperson, as you know well, there is a quarterly meeting of several committees that Standing Committee on Finance coordinates. And to be fair to SARS, they have in the last 2 years or so begun to find their feet in regard to this structure within SARS that deals with the illicit economy. And by many measures, they are doing reasonably okay. Of course, their difficulty, Comrade Chair, as you know, is they will tell you that they give information over to the hawks who don't have the investigative capacity. The NPA doesn't have the prosecution capacity to deal with complex crimes like this. So it's a multidisciplinary approach. We've raised this repeatedly in the Standing Committee on Finance and SECOF, and we need to put pressure on that. Finally, and really the figures are staggering. It's mining economies, Chairperson, as you well know, that are most vulnerable to illicit financial flows, and we are 10th worst in the world. And finally, on openness and transparency, whatever the faults of government and Parliament, we remain by independent institutions globally standards and assessments amongst the top 3 in the world when it comes to openness and transparency of information. And to a large extent, that filters down to the provinces, even if they might try, and municipalities to hide certain things. So I think let's be fair that, the Treasury has been remarkable in that regard, whatever other problems we have with them. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Karim. Quickly, Honorable Ryder, there's something you are dying. You say you'll die if you don't say.
It absolutely is, Chair. Just on PSAM again, they highlighted some issues around zero-based budgeting and the fact that there's pros and cons. And I think that this is something that gets highlighted a little bit later. ARTA also includes it in their presentation. I do think we need more information around zero-based budgeting, and not just from Treasury, but from some critics and from some supporters externally to the situation. I think zero-based budgeting is something that we think we support, but let's get more facts. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, Dennis is always dying. Don't be fooled by him.
Okay, thank you, honorable members. Quickly from my side, I just want to check with Public Service Accountability Monitor and C19 People's Coalition. Is there a process where you are able to interact with the executive, in particular with National Treasury? Again, because when we talk about people's participation, it should not only be through Parliament at that level. I would like to hear you. Secondly, about tax administration, especially around BEPS and illicit financial flows. The main thing we seem to be underlining is the question of the resources. Do we think that the problem is it's only financial when it comes to this area? I have a different view. I think money it's one of the explanatory variables in that equation, but there are many other things, and I in many instances I don't think a situation where we reduce the problem to the availability of financial resources. Sometimes it gives officials an out of jail card to say, no, our monies were reduced, therefore we can't carry on this thing. So I'm just saying, what's your take as far as that is concerned? One area that keeps on coming again is the cuts mainly in education and in health. How do we compare with other countries which are developing countries like ourselves as far as the percentage that we take and go to health and education? Again, I think my concern more or less is the same concern that we should be careful where we always identify the question of financial resources as the problem. Lastly, obviously the list of what we should be doing keeps on growing as government, but both presentations, I find them being very thin as to the sources of additional funds. I think is an area that I'll definitely, I would love you to comment on, or perhaps to look into as we move forward. Can we then allow you to respond to these questions, and do just like you did initially? I'll give you 10 minutes, and let's finish. Thank you. As you can see, most of our questions are more or less related to each other. Let's start with Public Service Accountability Monitor.
Thank you, Honourable Buthelezi. Should I put my camera back on? Or
yeah. I want to see you. People of South Africa want to see who Zuliswa is. Yeah.
Like to see me sweat. Thank you very much. To the committee for the questions. I think many of them are also good food for thought for us. To start with Honourable Joseph's question on the our stance on the financial integrity and fiscal governance. I think the point is well taken, Honourable Joseph's, around that there certainly are mechanisms in place, particularly at the national level in terms of fiscal governance. The concern we raise is particularly when we look at, for instance, we've done isolated expenditure tracking exercises, and the difficulty of being able to track finances from one level of government to another, and particularly at the provincial and municipal level, is that is where many of year after year, I think not just in terms of AG's reports, but also in terms of our own observations, year after year, there are gaps in terms of financial integrity and governance at those levels of government. And so it isn't necessarily just about the overarching transparency and the overarching mechanisms, although those we do note are quite significant. The measures you ask, what measures do we use? On the one hand, I think in the past we've discussed, the open budget survey as one measure in terms of transparency of documentation. But in recent years, it's also become evident that there is a need to drill down deeper. And so whether it is about finding, the ability to track, funds is actually quite difficult when you are outside of the state. And we are arguing that it should be possible, regardless of where you stand, to track public resources. And so I think I speak for many of the presenters today. Many of us are relatively well resourced in terms of the capacity to do that work, to put in the time. But in essence, it shouldn't be that rigorous. It shouldn't be that difficult. And so that's what we really are saying needs to be strengthened, which in the long term has direct impacts in terms of the governance and safeguarding of public resources. On honourable, and of course, in relation to the zero-based budgeting, I think that was more an observation, but less a question. Honourable Matafa's also well noted and well taken. On the question of transparency and openness, again, the issue is at the ability to on the one hand even get disaggregated budget data and information that is regularly available. So while there are, for example, the sectional requirements for reporting, the point for us where we stand is that unless you are, and this shouldn't be the case, unless you have connections, with an official who's able to pass on in your reports, which are public documents, it is very difficult, accessing websites, and very often, if you were to look right now, I mean, I can speak on the record to say, if we were to look right now at all 9 provincial treasury websites to determine the availability of extensive in-year reporting to allow us to kind of have this kind of look and have this information, we would really struggle. And there's not only patchy information, it's also not, so I hope I'm articulating that clearly. So I would say that it's not so much about additional regulatory requirements and rules. It's actually more about ensuring that information is made available publicly, and that you need not be within the state and have special connections. The Honourable Ryder's point around illicit financial flows, and I think raised by other committee members as well. I think it is very encouraging to hear that emphasis from committee members as well. One of the things that for us would be quite important is we do list some kind of explicit recommendations, for example, in relation to public procurement. I think it is also very encouraging to note that the public procurement bill is currently out and there is work being done. We've also worked to outline some of the transparency problems and potential issues within the bill. And so that there are various ways in which current levels of transparency can be deepened in order to effect the meaningful levels of safeguarding against illicit financial flows. For instance, ensuring that we are able to incorporate and use high quality open data in the context of open contracting, introducing open contracting data standards, introducing beneficial ownership reporting in order to allow for better analysis and detection of corruption, being able to link, for example, ownership of companies quite easily. There's a range, and perhaps just a last point, which is encouraging and something that the committee may well want to emphasize, is the current amendments in the context of the Public Administration Act and the Public Service, which we think is a really important opportunity as well to entrench some of those, in addition to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, National Anti-Corruption Forum, National NAC. I believe, that was covering Honourable Matafa and some of Honourable Ryder's points. The zero-based budgeting, definitely couldn't agree more. One of the areas that we are hoping to spend some more time on is to look at, on the one hand, what that kind of system or what kind of zero-based budgeting, on the one hand, would actually strengthen state capacity, but on the other would build, and I think this is an important point, build the trust relations between civic actors and the public, and those who are charged with effecting, implementing policies to spend, to use public funds. So it is an opportunity in many respects, and one that could be better utilized. The PBO has also shared some really important findings or really important information, and I think I agree there is space for that to be, for better deliberation and that to be informed by other actors. Then finally, on Honourable Buthelezzi's points, and I hope I'm not missing any from any members of the committee, but also agree, I think that the issue of financial resources is a really important one, and for us that is why we do try to really look at the systemic issues. So very often adding funds to an entity that isn't likely to either manage those funds adequately, or in fact there are other capacity issues, or, and I think this is also an important aspect, whether there are political barriers that go beyond financial issues. So I would agree with that point, and perhaps reiterate as well that I think it in many respects it's a cliche to say this, but I think it is worth repeating that very often it is the problem of not using existing funds prudently and optimally, and wastage of funds is a fundamental issue. So that we would say in all what we've laid out today, perhaps one of the fundamental lessons is precisely that savings can be made by making better use of resources and safeguarding. The interactions between with ourselves and other actors and the National Treasury, I must say, and I think also worth putting on the record, that there are opportunities both in the context of the parliamentary and parliamentary space, but also that in the past certainly the National Treasury has made efforts to engage civic actors, also public outreaches to universities. We've worked on a particular fiscal transparency project with the National Treasury, and so I think it is important to outline and agree with many members who have said that there are attempts and there are existing efforts to build participation and transparency, and what we would then say is that certainly is scope to do more, and in particular to ensure that the spaces that are existing are much better at facilitating broader civic participation. But I agree with you, Honourable Buthelezzi, it also would be important perhaps for the committee to oblige other line ministries, not just the Treasury, to find ways to more meaningfully engage members of the public, not just what I would essentially call civil society organizations like ourselves. But I think I'll stop there, and I hope I haven't missed any questions.
No, thank you, and that was well within your time, so thank you very much, Dr. Hoffman. It's your turn.
Thank you so much. These were really excellent questions, and I think I would like to begin by noting that there simply isn't enough time to engage substantively with these questions. The questions that the honourable members raised today require systematic debate and public deliberation. So while I will give some provisional answers today, I would like to request the Commission that you set aside time to deliberate these, provide written comments in public, and then invite us back for a much longer conversation about some of these important substantive issues that you have raised. So, Honourable Member Dennis Joseph raised the question about public participation, which I was surprised by because the last time I was here 2 weeks ago, we noted the concerns with public participation in the process of the Division of Revenue Bill. So I will repeat my concerns from 2 weeks ago. We're concerned with the obstacles to public participation and oversight for the budget because 25 billion rand was reduced from the public service wage bill in the provincial equitable share, but the adjusted provincial budgets are not yet publicly available. They weren't publicly available 2 weeks ago. They're still not publicly available. And as a result, there's little detail on how these reductions will be carried out through reductions in salaries or reductions in the number of personnel, and whether these reductions will focus on management positions or frontline posts such as teachers and municipal workers. So the lack of detailed information on the nature of these wage cuts demonstrates a lack of rigor insofar as budgeting processes with complex and possibly unforeseen consequences are not subject to correction by public oversight and deliberation. So a lack of rigor. I want to underline this. It is a lack of rigor. Such obstacles for meaningful public participation are arguably a step back for democratic process. Honourable Buthelezi asked about what opportunities there are for us to participate in Treasury. And I think the answer is that there are very few opportunities for civil society to work together with Treasury to co-develop budgets outside of NEDLAC. And Parliament is one of our few spaces for participation. So we would ask that you create more spaces, that there are systematic institutionalized spaces for civil society to work together with Treasury to co-develop budgets. Honourable Malitsane asked about alternative to the wage bill cuts, and I think this was a similar issue that was brought up by Honourable Karim in terms of which trade-offs. And I think, again, 2 weeks ago, we answered this question, we preempted this question, but I will repeat what we said 2 weeks ago. We said we recommend strengthening institutions for oversight, not cutting their budgets, in order to reduce the billions flowing out of departments in the form of inflated contracts and to retrieve the billions lost to revenue in illicit financial flows. And if trade-offs need to be made, let the highest paid civil servants take the biggest cuts. We recommend implementing a 1 to 5 pay gap ratio, which will significantly cut the wage bill and bring management closer to the people. So, Honourable Karim, Honourable Moletsane, we would like for you to begin by cutting your wages first, and for cutting the wages of Treasury officials and members of Parliament and all of the management in municipal and provincial levels before cutting the wages of our teachers and our nurses and our municipal workers. We would also like to see an end to the 20 billion rand in medical aid tax credits, which is an immoral and unsustainable subsidy to the wealthy. Okay, so those are the questions around alternatives to the wage bill cuts. There was a question also around Oliver Tambo, the emergency in Oliver Tambo. And the question was, what is C19 doing? Well, C19 members have been to Oliver Tambo district and have raised funds to support, but it's simply not enough. You cannot rely on civil society. You cannot outsource key state responsibilities to civil society. We are here to remind the state of its obligations to the people. There was also a question around the grants and in terms of what delays there have been and whether we have investigated these delays. Yes, Pay the Grants has been working with Black Sash to monitor the voices and experiences from the ground, but implementation of the grants has been abhorrent, in part because the systems have been so undercapacitated. This is why we need system strengthening. If you want to find out more about this, we recommend you go to the C19 website and have a look at the Pay the Grants section where we document this in detail. There was a question around defense funding from Honorable Ryder, who attempted to invoke xenophobia in order to justify additional spending on defense. But we have a severe social reproduction and unemployment crisis, and this is a disgusting attempt to weaponize this crisis by encouraging xenophobia by those in power. We reject these forms of hate mongering. And then finally, there was a question from Honorable Mbutelezi around how much are we spending on health relative to other countries. So this is a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. We already spend more than 8% of our national income on the health sector, which is very high for our income level. Turkey, for example, which is a good health performer, spends about 4.3% of its GDP, and Thailand, which has global universal health coverage, only spends 3.7%. But we actually, not all of that 8% goes to public health, right? In fact, the private sector captures the majority of health spending. So in 2016, for instance, our state spent 191 billion rand on public health, but the private sector netted 198 billion rand through medical aid fees, out-of-pocket payments, and the government employees medical scheme. Then there's the medical tax credits, which is another 20 billion rand in lost income from the state. And so the result is that the private sector captures 80% of our doctors, even though only 16% of our people have medical aid. The problem is not fundamentally one about resources, it is about the politics of resource distribution. And as health economists have observed with incredulity, while Ghana and Thailand are much poorer countries than South Africa, they've managed to implement a fairly well-functioning NHI. So it's all signs that in South Africa, the state refuses to implement the NHI, not because we don't have enough resources, but because there is no political will. Yeah, so I think I'm hoping that we have answered the majority of questions here today. And I'm very, very glad to see that there is attention being paid to the issue of illicit financial flows and to the question of how to strengthen tax administration. We would very much encourage further deliberations on this particular issue. And again, we would ask that perhaps the committee set aside time for more kind of in-depth reflection and public deliberation on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zugisa and Dr. Hoffman. As I let you go, please feel free to follow up on some of the questions by writing back to us. And I'm definitely requesting that we have the areas that we're very passionate about. Please write back to us. If we were to talk about Dr. Hoffman, the last matter that you were addressing, especially for instance around health and what you think we're doing wrong, because as you know that we're appropriating money here, but as you are saying that is the politics of appropriating money around those areas the correct one? I would like to hear more on that one. And can I also request that we have got views about the public procurement bill. It would be good if you were to share that with us. Perhaps then these few points, which I'll say them without condescending in any way, that for me it's good to hear young people having interest on matters of government and making their views heard, especially around issues of budget and budgetary issues. I think that's very encouraging, and I don't want you to be discouraged and say we've been raising these issues, but we seem not to be working. I think if you listen to the debates of the oral members, they repeat some of the things that you raise here on verbatim. So let's keep on talking and interacting. And I can't agree more with both the Public Service Accountability Monitor and C19 People's Coalition that we need more time to interact. And For instance, when I was looking at, when we're putting up today's list, I could see that I don't remember us having so many people wanting to comment, but the time that we are giving is very, very much limited. And sometimes we are constrained by parliamentary processes. I think it's the time that you take preparing these things, we need more time from our side again to interact. And I'll ask our members that, can we note that and see how we better that, so that we are seen to be responding to this. And lastly, I think as we continue again, the concern which has always been raised, in particular by Honorable Karim, is the question of allowing most South Africans, even those who are in the remotest part of our country, because they are the ones perhaps who end up being affected mostly, and in some instances negatively, by this budget. That let's find ways of also engaging with them, so that we can also hear their views. By the way, they've got views too, so that this process is not seen as an esoteric process, but where it's a process of every South African, where they know that they can come and make these presentations or make their views known to us. But thank you very much. Let's continue with the other speakers. You can remain, but if you want, you are excused. Babalo, can you fly to the agenda again, so that we can see? I know Outa is coming, Kosat is coming, but just for the benefit of the honorable members, so that they see who'll be making presentations, and for the people who are looking at this thing, right? So we are having Outa, we're having COSATU, we're having UNICEF, we're having Western Cape Commissioner for Children and Center for Early Childhood Development. As you can see, we are all having 15 minutes to make your presentations. You said you want to make your presentations on the 2020 medium-term budget policy statement, and you'll all be given 15 minutes, and please time yourselves. Can I start with Mr. Matt Johnston from Outa?
Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Please go.
Will the presentation be shared? Yeah, there it goes. Okay, good morning, honorable members, and good morning, Chairperson and the co-presenters. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'd like to take the opportunity to just indicate our regret at hearing about the passing of Mr. Kimi Makwetu and Professor Daniel Plaatjes, both of whom we see as real giants in the financial space of government. And I'll jump right into it. So next slide, please. We think this is an extremely important opportunity, a moment in our fiscal policy history or journey as a country that we really need to take action immediately. We've seen increasing expenditure, Chairperson. I take our longer submission as read, as well as the presentation. So I'm just going to fly through this and really get to the point. And the point is, we're looking at a qualitative issue of value for money. We've seen consistent expenditure and increases of expenditure, increases in public debt, but we haven't seen increases in the quality of service delivery. We therefore are really going to get to the core recommendations of allocative and productive efficiency. That is eliminating expenses that are unnecessary and really optimizing those expenses that we must retain. Next slide, please. So we do look at the wage bill and we say that it is not sustainable. But Chairperson, we want to be very clear, and we agree with the previous speakers that this must be a differential approach, both in terms of income bands, but also most importantly in terms of performance and labor productivity, and what we actually get for the expenditure on particular groups of public servants. We also support the zero-based budgeting principle, which I'll get to in a while. But we are really alluding to productive and allocative efficiency. And we must recognize, Chairperson, even though we're not focusing on a quantitative approach in this presentation on the position that we are in as a country and the risk to our economic sovereignty and the sovereignty of this government to make decisions on how money is spent if our public debt really spirals out of control. Next slide, please. So we have to acknowledge the serious limitation in tax revenue and the decrease that we've seen this year as a result of the pandemic, of lockdown. Now, we really support consolidation of government, Chairperson. We're thinking of, in particular, for example, the Department of Public Enterprises, how that could be consolidated or completely dissolved and its functions distributed to other departments. We want to really see more focus on the stringency of public servants and politicians doing business with the state. We note the President's commitment that that is something that needs to change, and perhaps labor laws need to change as well. Now, we're also focusing on technology, Chairperson, and the CETA, for example, its performance being extremely poor, that if it cannot be improved, that perhaps it should be shut down. But in general, we really do support the role of technology in public procurement. And we agree with previous speakers that the Public Procurement Bill does not adequately address transparency, that the regulator would have much too much power to decide who can and who cannot see how government decides to spend money. Next slide, please. So we are strongly opposed to the reprioritization of funds to finance SAA. We're thinking, for example, that the rail infrastructure of this country could do much better with that kind of capital expenditure, something that much more impoverished and marginalized people use than SAA. We also agree that the MPA, SARS, the SIU and IPID, as well as Statistics South Africa, should get a bigger chunk of the pie. I think I don't need to repeat why we think that is a good idea. But we also, Chairperson, particularly for this committee, would like to call for the FFC and the PBO and others to come and address the committees as well as the committees on finance with particular instructions to give advice on the improved management of contingent liabilities. And we also want to flag the fact that the wage bill and its proposed capping is still not set in stone, and that could very much backfire. And we do believe that government must pay very close attention to what would we do in that event that it backfires. And we also agree with the sentiment of previous speakers that it cannot be provincial and municipal entities who suffer as a result of that. Chairperson, yeah, let me skip the rest and move on. We very much emphasize performance measurement outcomes. And what we've seen thus far is extremely disappointing. Many targets in government and particular spending programs, Chair, have not been met. And in response, there haven't been consequences. Rather, the targets have been reduced, as you can see in these examples. And we don't find that acceptable. Of course, reducing allocations is not simply the solution, but surely there must be qualitative interventions as well. And I'll get to the point where we're recommending, for example, that when audit outcomes are not satisfactory or do not indicate or demonstrate improvement from year to year, that those responsible at the municipal and provincial level must be held accountable. And that if they are proving incapable of improving, if they're proving incapable of improving the audit outcomes of their jurisdiction, that they should be disciplined or they should be replaced. Next slide, please. Then we really focused on a few sectors that we believe must undergo reprioritization. That is energy, transport, water and sanitation, and local government in particular. We really note, honorable members, a very serious concern about politicized spending programs that are really contributing to an increasingly constrained fiscal environment, putting a lot of pressure on taxpayers. And we should agree, Chairperson, with previous speakers as well, that we have now put, and I should put this on record, that we have put a proposal and a request to the Standing and Select Committees on Finance to review the public participation process of Parliament. We, for example, are recommending that the budget review and recommendations reports done by portfolio committees must also be inclusive, must also have mandatory opportunities for civil society and ordinary people to come and give their views. Next slide, please. Then on energy in particular, I'll run through this, Chair. We are really looking at a just energy transition. We're looking at entities like Nexa that are underperforming but still receive adequate allocations. And this is an example of a broader pattern of consistent appropriations to entities and departments that underperform. And we believe that this must change. And that when we talk about trade-offs and where money can come from, I think we should take our cue from the Auditor General's reports to a large extent, as well as the Fiscal and Financial Commission. And I'll get to the recommendation where we're suggesting that they must come to these committees and give their suggestions for how, for example, the structure of local government and its financing model should change, because we believe that is not sustainable. We really are bemoaning mega plant construction, thinking of Medupi and Kusile and how those costs have escalated, whether being locked into a fossil fuel-based energy system is really what we want as a country. Whether it's sustainable, we believe it is not. And the escalations of those projects, Chairperson, we don't think it's fair for that to be translated into tariff increases, which makes electricity unaffordable. Although we do strongly agree with the need for energy security. Now, we also saying that all proposals for additional sources of energy must be lawful and must be in terms of the integrated resource plan. And we've seen favoring of nuclear energy, which does not seem to align with that plan. Next slide, please. Transport, Chairperson, I don't need to say much. I think this committee is perfectly aware of what's happening at PRASA. We are basically recommending a regionalization of the rail system and an unbundling of PRASA, and the Competition Commission has made the same recommendation. We believe the rail sector needs to get much more dedication, more financing, but on the condition that the system is much better managed. Next slide, please. On roads, we really do remain steadfast, and we are quite astounded to see the silence of government on the shutting down of e-tolls, which was in the pipeline. We're not sure where that is at the moment, but we strongly suggest that the PIC overpriced GFIB and that they basically funded this and gave bonds to that effect. And we're calling for the finance minister to renegotiate the terms of the payback, that period for the PIC Sunrail bonds. And we also note ARTO and its intention to increase road safety. And we don't believe it's going to achieve that purpose. We believe that it's going to run into serious constitutional difficulties and challenges. And that seems to be an effort to make money rather than to ensure the safety of road users. Next slide, please. Water and sanitation, Chair, this is a massive problem that we believe must undergo serious scrutiny. We've communicated with the Portfolio Committee on Water and Sanitation and Human Settlements to recommend an independent water regulator, knowing the issues of water boards, their relationship with municipalities, that financial chaos. We believe there must be an independent intervention there, but we have yet to hear anything from the Portfolio Committee, and we strongly suggest that this committee couples with them to look at what's happening in the water sector. Next slide, please. Local government, again, we're recommending in essence that the FFC and the PBO undertake research and come to these committees with their views on how the system can change. We note the Municipal Systems Amendment Bill, which is on the verge of being finalized, and we strongly agree with that, agree with legislation that prohibits political interference in the business of local government. And again, Chairperson, we strongly arguing for accountability, strongly saying that when local governments do not perform, that there must be consequences for the executive and accounting authorities in particular, but to those responsible especially. We also want to suggest that these committees reach out to provincial treasuries and make sure that they are playing their role. Chairperson, that's also been mentioned. And we think that the provincial level of oversight is very much lacking. And we think that these committees can play a role in fixing that. Next slide, please. Zero-based budgeting, Chair, we note the interest in this. We are very much in support of it. And that's basically what we're recommending here. We do believe Parliament can play a much stronger role in that. And we really hope that in due course, the final outcome of these engagements will not just be a unconditional recommendation that whichever bill must be approved and adopted. We believe that budgets must be scrutinized and they must change. But it is not the panacea, and we really questioned National Treasury last time with the finance committees on who is going to be responsible for carrying out the zero-based budgeting analyses. It cannot be those who are actually responsible for the poor financial position of entities and departments that really demands this intervention. Next slide, please. Parliamentary oversight, Chair, as I've alluded to, we really think that this needs to be bolstered. We appreciate what Parliament does, and this is not to say that Parliament is doing nothing, but in many instances, that is exactly the case. In many instances, we've seen that Parliament has really overlooked or ignored or failed to effectively intervene in issues of misspending that it is aware of. And we recognize how much money Parliament gets. We recognize, and we've been analyzing what Parliament spends its money on, and we really think that it can be spent better, that more engagements can be hosted as has been requested by other presenters, and that technological solutions can be brought on board instead of very generous salaries and instead of very generous travel allowances for members. Next slide, please. And again, we just want to recognize outcomes and the need for Parliament and entities themselves, provincial treasuries and national treasury, to look at these outcomes.
Are you still there?
It looks like we have lost him, Chair.
Okay. Please, do you have his mobile? Let me see how much time. In any case, he was just left with 1 minute.
Apologies, Chair. My connection dropped.
Okay.
Sorry.
Please come back. You have 1 more minute to finalize your presentation.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I think this speaks for itself, but I'll go to the final slide. Thank you. To the key recommendations. Yeah, we are. Thank you, Chair, for the extra minute. The wage bill needs to be addressed. We think that it is beyond what is necessary and justified in terms of labour productivity. We really call for an investigation into the hiring practices at departments and entities that were restructured for the purposes of state capture. We think there are many examples of that. We're suggesting the professionalization of the public service. We strongly advocate allocative and productive efficiency, as I said, eliminating what's unnecessary and making what is necessary more efficient. Zero-based budgeting, we strongly support that it must be implemented at all levels of government, but we need clarity from Treasury on who exactly is going to be responsible for those decisions. And we suggest more funding and support for the MPA, SARS, SIU, IPIT, and Stats SA. We suggest that parliamentary committees improve their oversight role, and we as civil society, I think everyone would agree, strongly offer ourselves and our resources to assist in that in any way. And we want to protect the fiscal framework against crisis budgeting, to be more proactive, to get input. This committee and others should get input on improved management of contingent liabilities, FFC and PBO to come and give their presentations on how local government and its financing model can be restructured. And finally, we suggest that these committees oversee the provincial treasuries and ensure that they carry out their oversight role as well. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Altan. Mr. Johnston, can we have it's COSATU, Matthew?
No, good morning, Honourable Chairperson, Honourable members. Yes, no, thank you for giving COSATU space to share our views and our concerns and our proposals. Apologies if some of them are matters that you're familiar with, but nonetheless, they are quite critical. I think first, Chair, where we start differing with government immediately is what is our fundamental crisis right now. And for us as COSATU, as trade unions, as workers, our number one crisis is the economic recession, is the fact that we have 52% unemployment, that we lost 2.2 million jobs. We recognize that the debt is a crisis and we cannot allow it to increase recklessly, and the trajectory is worrying. But I think for us right now, Comrade Chair and members, is about a balanced approach, about tackling the recession, saving jobs, and then putting us on a sustainable path towards reducing the debt in a non-reckless way. We're concerned that the focus of government has simply been about slashing expenditure and not about stimulating economic growth. Comrade Chair, if you don't have workers employed, they can't pay income tax. If companies close, they cannot pay company tax. And you need these jobs and workers to exist, and companies to exist, if you hope to grow the economy. Chair, we really had hoped to hear from government a much more decisive approach to fix the state leakages, which are the heart of the fiscal crisis. That is the corruption, wasteful expenditure, the collapsing SOEs, the decapacitation of SARS, and to find a sustainable approach to debt reduction. Next slide, Libobalo. So just the next slide. So, Chair, we made quite a few proposals as COSATU and NEDLAC to government around corruption. We feel that you have to tackle corruption to begin to rebuild the state, to release money for essential public services, for economic growth. I must say, Chair, it's been very frustrating engaging with government, to be honest, because on every single point, they have been less than enthusiastic. We had raised the need to have rapid response anti-corruption courts. What we've seen in the Appropriations Adjustment Bill is to reduce the justice budget by 773 million rand. We had all supported the Auditing Amendment Act that was passed about 2 years ago to empower the state to hold personally liable offending management and politicians. We have yet to see one person being held liable under that act. We've seen very few compromised politicians or management being refused. I think we must acknowledge the good work being done by the new SARS Commissioner, but much more needs to be done. And again, their Chair, SARS is a useful investment of public resources. It returns significantly on investments. Yet we've seen in the Adjustment Appropriations Bill that SARS's budget has been cut by 200+ million rand. Yet they have a shortage of about 700 key staff. Chair, we really had hoped to see an open online public procurement system for the entire state, not just for the public service departments, but to include entities, SOEs, municipalities. What we have seen, Chair, which is extremely worrying, is that despite the delays of many years in fast-tracking the public procurement bill to overhaul a very archaic and leaky public procurement system, the Treasury wants another 2 years to process the public procurement bill. We just don't think we can have this level of lethargy in the state, Comrade Chair, given the scale of the crisis we face. I think we also, during the PPE scandals recently, the need for central public procurement of certain large items in the state, and yet we've not seen government move with any speed. Chair, the one issue which you have raised, the President spoke to it eloquently, and we appreciate that. He spoke at the NEC Lekgotla of the ANC and at Parliament and the Economic Recovery Plan tabling, was about the need to ban politicians, the spouses and the children from doing business with the state. And I must say, Chair, the lack of enthusiasm from our comrades in government to that is very worrying. If we were a country like Cuba or Singapore where corruption is not a pandemic like it is here, sure, you could say it's fine. But what we've seen right now, Chairperson, is that unfortunately, the spouses and children of politicians are often the conduit for tenders and is destroying the state. We need to see decisive action around corruption, specifically from the leadership of government and the ruling parties, and we're not seeing a chairperson. And that is going to destroy the liberation movement, if I can be very honest. Next slide. Chair, on the wage bill, I mean, this is really at the heart of the MTBPS and then MTF. Chair, look, I think as COSATU, we're very frustrated. We think that government is undermining collective bargaining, which is a constitutional right. We think that the fact that Parliament is going to adopt this MTF, which is basically going to impose 4 years, is collapsing the space for collective bargaining in the Public Service Bargaining Council. Despite some of the stats being thrown around, the wage bill has been stable at 35% of the budget since 2009. The headcount, in fact, per population ratio is plummeting, and we're seeing the consequences of a declining capacity to deliver essential public services. Where you should have 6 nurses on duty, you now have 1 nurse on duty. Correctional service officers' lives are at risk because they're understaffed. We're seeing doctors working 48-hour shifts, and as a consequence, the care they can give to patients is not going to be what you need. The 4-year wage freeze, Comrade Chair, is going to see an increasing levels of poaching of skilled public servants by private schools, for example, for teachers, by the Middle East, by Canada, for doctors and nurses, etc. It's going to see a brain drain. And we don't think, Chair, it's correct to compare the public service with the private sector. The private sector includes cashiers who are paid poverty wages. It includes farm workers who are paid slave wages. Those are not the types of workers you have in the public service. Next slide. Chair, look, as COSATU, we are cognizant of the need to save the state. If the state collapses, if we go the IMF route, it'll be workers who will suffer the most. So that's why we think government has to engage the Public Service Bargaining Council in good faith, honor the existing agreement. Let's fast track the next 3-year wage agreement and see how can we help each other. We've made proposals, Chair, of numerous ways to save billions of rands. For example, having a single agreement for the entire state, but equally, whatever compromise you want to make, politicians need to lead from the front. We think the politicians, especially ministers, premiers, deputy ministers, etc., the exorbitant packages need to be slashed by 30%. That's something the government can do tomorrow, but has not shown an appetite to doing it. We think the ministerial handbook must simply be scrapped. And last Sunday's Sunday Times article about former ministers, even going as far back as the National Party era, still enjoying 46 or so free flights per annum, including their wives. And that has been paid by Parliament. It's scandalous, Chairperson. And really, there must be accountability in government. There must be sensitivity towards the anger of the public at large. We think, Chair, that you need to reduce what management earns, but also significantly to put public service salary caps on what management and SOEs and entities earn. Because right now, Chairperson, you have a CEO of a water board earning R1 million a month. So how do you tell a nurse to tighten her belt when she earns less than 200,000 Rand a year? Chair, I think the fundamental principle is to protect lower and middle income public servants from inflation. And there are ways to assist, for example, with home loans from the GPF to cushion the blow to public servants. Next slide. Chair, I think one of the concerning parts about the Adjustment Appropriations Bill is that there's no linkage to what the Auditor General's reports say every year about the state of our departments and our entities. They list that on average, we're losing about 10% of our budget to wasteful expenditure, irregular expenditure, corruption, yet we don't see any actions proposed in the bill to address this. So that basically says to us, it's business as usual. And you would see every day new reports of scandals in different levels of government, and nothing is done. Next slide. Chair, I think for us, we do appreciate the need to shift funds. We are worried, though, about the impact of some of those funds. For example, the 17 billion Rand cut from municipal grants, and what is the impact upon infrastructure, which is key to growing the economy, to providing essential services. Next slide. Chair, I think some of the most worrying parts from the bill, in terms of the cuts, I think the previous speaker did allude to the CCMA, where we've seen a 35 million Rand cut from there. That basically means they can no longer provide conciliation services. They're no longer going to allow walk-in workers who have lost their jobs or have been robbed of their wages to come in. And this, when you're having an increase of retrenchments and wage cuts and abuses of workers. For us, Chair, cutting the CCMA is not going to make a dent overall, but it has a huge impact upon workers on the ground and should be reversed. Equally, Chair, when we've seen Metro Rail being stripped dry during this lockdown and we're cutting 2.5 billion Rand from rail transport, it doesn't make sense. Though equally, we have to be honest, the report recently that PRASA sitting on billions of rand of unspent allocations equally is a crisis. Chair, tourism, which includes your hospitality, restaurants, etc., is extremely worrying. The department's been cut by 54 million rand, yet this industry is on its knees and it actually needs relief. We can't understand, Chair, why we want to cut from SARS when SARS is a department which generates money for the state. It's equally worrying, Comrade Chair, that we're cutting almost 6 billion rand from the police. We're cutting under 1 billion rand from justice, 1 billion rand from correctional services, and ironically, 376 million rand from health. The impact upon cutting of higher education by 1.6 billion rand, Comrade Chair, is worrying because at the same time, universities are now increasing their fees despite workers not getting wage increases. Next slide. Chair, there are some shifts in the budget that we do welcome. I think we must appreciate and applaud the extension of the 350 rand unemployment grant. We think, Chair, at about 2 billion rand a month, it is affordable, it's sustainable to continue to go on beyond that. That is the basic income grant in its genesis, which we think all political parties support. So we think we'd rather need to find the money to continue it. We can fix all its many glitches afterward, that's fine. But if you stop it in January, then we can say goodbye to it. It won't come back. And you really need to have this basic income grant when you're in the height of a crisis, not when things are better. Chair, I mean, the shifting of some 77 million rand to DTI's industrial financing is better than the supplementary budget when it was cut by almost 2 billion rand. But again, if you want to create industries, create manufacturing, we should be giving more to DTI. Again, there's a return on investment to the state, to the economy. The 300 million rand for home affairs is welcome. Chair, we know there's been a lot of discussion around the SAA assistance, and of course that debt must be paid. But I think what we often miss in this discussion, and we appreciate the emotions on all sides, is that there are 10,000 workers at SAA, 1,500 workers at SA Express who have not had their wages for this past year. There needs to be a humane approach, a balanced approach to help those workers find jobs or to save their jobs. But simply to throw them under the bus is not a sustainable way. But we agree with both Ministers Gordhan and Mboweni. Let's fast track this airline resolution issue. Chair, I think the other issues we welcome, and I think that they're self-explanatory. In particular, the environmental 1.7 billion rand to create some jobs there. Chair, that the sport and arts and culture 155 million rand is a welcome allocation to sports, athletes, to artists, musicians. But that department has been inundated with problems, and there's been a failure of that department to actually direct that relief to those artists and musicians who badly need it. And in fact, they've underspent. And I think that is a crisis that Parliament should try to help to intervene to address those blockages. And the Musicians Union has really struggled to engage with the department in that regard. Next slide. Chair, I'll just kind of move towards the end. I think my time will be ending soon. I think, Chair, as you had said in the previous hearings, the real solution is to rebuild the economy. That's the only real sustainable approach. We had supported the economic recovery plan. We had engaged extensively on it. There are many positive aspects to it. For example, the infrastructure programs around energy and rail, roads and water. But we don't see enough in the bill speaking to that. And that makes us concerned about its implementation. We were informed yesterday by Treasury that Regulation 28 will be amended soon to open up infrastructure investments to the pension funds to invest in. We think that's a welcome impetus to the economy. But there are other structural reforms that need to be fast-tracked and prioritized, and there seem to be endless delays on them, including digital spectrum. I think, Chair, also critical for us is ramping up local procurement, both in the public, private sector, and consumer levels. Next slide. Chair, I think to say, look, as COSATU, we're not just complaining about issues. We have tried to also come with solutions and compromises. The Eskom Social Compact that we drafted will be signed by the 8th of December by government and social partners at NEDLAC. We're keen for it to be implemented. And that's key to it has been our support to provide debt relief to Eskom in exchange for the social compact's implementation, dealing with corruption, ramping up investments, etc. So I think this is our part as contribution as Labour to help rebuild the state and rebuild the economy. But again, Chairperson, government needs to come to its part, to play its part. You can't have departments, municipalities owing about 40 billion rand to Eskom. Yet we want workers to make sacrifices. Government has to play its role. Next slide. Chair, there needs to be very clear roadmap for other SOEs, and we'll really have to question what are different ministers doing when their SOEs are collapsing. What is the Department of Communications doing To save SABC, provide a clear roadmap, for example. What is a roadmap for Denel? We have not seen these ones. But there has to be alternatives than to simply allow management of these SOEs to retrench workers left and right. Next slide. I think we can skip this one, Chair. Thanks. Next slide. Chair, just getting to the end, we managed to inject about 53 billion rand from the UF into the economy during this period. It's been extended until October 15th. We think government needs to release another 2 months of UF relief into the economy that are provided an additional about 5 billion rand, and there is sufficient funds available. But to date, government has been very reluctant to do so, despite restricting certain workers and workplaces from reopening. Next slide. Chair, I think there has to be a sustained economic relief package beyond January. It needs to come from a combination of sources, from the UIF under the TERS program, from SARS with tax relief for distressed companies, also from Treasury with allocations, but also the banks have to come to the party. They can't continue to sit on the sidelines. They need to provide lower interest rates, debt relief, write off certain credit, etc. But Chair, I mean, it really is shameful that the loan guarantee scheme, which the President announced in April, to date has only dispersed 8% of the 200 billion rand. And it seems government is just simply walking away from it and not making any interventions in it, despite public statements. Next slide. I think we can skip this one, Chairperson. So yeah, Chair, let me get to the end. I think, Chair, as COSATU, we recognize the crisis we're in. We believe strongly in the social compact spirit that it takes government, business, and labor all to compromise and to contribute and even to sacrifice. We're always willing as our side as labor to make those contributions. But I think we need to understand from government, is government really willing to engage in a serious way and to address its own incapacities, its own failings, and to respond to public concerns. And to date, we've not seen that. I think the same thing with the private sector. They need to really show their commitment to rebuilding the country, to end the investment strike, to show more solidarity to other companies and in particular to workers. But yes, let me stop there, Comrade Chair, and I hope I've kept my time limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Parks. I think who's next? It's UNICEF. UNICEF, please follow take the cue from the previous speakers. 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Buthelezi, Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Appropriations in the National Assembly, honorable members of the Joint Committee on Appropriations, officials in the National Treasury and all other government departments, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christine Muhigana and I'm the UNICEF representative in South Africa. I thank you very much for the opportunity to make this formal input in the public hearings that deal with the medium-term budget policy statement and the second adjusted estimates for 2020. Chairperson, 2020 has presented South Africa and the globe with immense challenges, especially around the ability of countries to address the ravages brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa has responded with remarkable alacrity to the challenges of the pandemic and set aside substantial public funds to address the immediate social, health, economic consequences of the pandemic. Unlike natural disasters, where the standard public finance advice is to respond early, go big, and target households, we do not know nearly enough about the virus and the pandemic to be totally prescriptive about how best the government of South Africa should respond to the social and economic challenges that accompany this public health emergency. At a minimum, we would want the government to retain the flexibility to respond to the evolving pandemic as best as it sees fit in the context of the country's strained public finance position. UNICEF, as part of the United Nations family and as a partner of the South African government, has continued to contribute to efforts at alleviating the burden of the pandemic. This, Mr. Chairman, includes supporting the Department of Social Development to make the argument for the top-ups to the social grants for children, supporting the Department of Health to implement childhood immunization drive to catch up on all missed immunizations by the end of March 2021. This is part of its strategic focus to ensure routine child health and nutrition services are maintained during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. UNICEF integrated its COVID-19 prevention messaging with crucial health communication promoting the continued safe use and health services on the ground, services which have continued to function and provide critical life-saving support. UNICEF supported the Department of Basic Education to scale up mass e-learning, online and app-based access with private sector input. We supported the Department of Social Development with a large-scale evaluation initiative to better understand the extent to which the DSD has enabled and supported vulnerable children and families during the COVID-19 crisis. Through our water, sanitation, and hygiene response, more than 130 hand washing stations with soap have been erected across 9 provinces, alongside the ongoing distribution of 10,000 wash kits containing soap, sanitizer, masks, and cleaning products for vulnerable households. And in supporting the Department of Basic Education, a total of 120 schools across 7 provinces will receive improved access to hand washing facilities, a critical response to help keep schools open and safe. During these unprecedented times, how best do we then, Mr. Chairperson, frame the public finance and human dignity challenges? And what does all of this mean for our core constituencies, namely our children? In 2020, Statistics South Africa and UNICEF released the first ever multidimensional poverty study for children. This was the result of a 3-year-long collaboration between our agencies, and the result of that baseline sustainable development goal study were quite startling. 62.1% of our children are considered multidimensionally poor. 42% of our children suffer from both income poverty and multidimensional poverty. Almost 2/3 of children who live in rural areas are both income poor and multidimensionally poor. And key determinants of children's multidimensional poverty are poor social infrastructure in health and basic education, poor waste disposal practices in communities, poor and variable access to early childhood education, and children whose progress is much slower at the upper end of the schooling system. The country's baseline results on the SDGs, on the Sustainable Development Goals for multidimensional poverty, measures for children point to the need to maintain consistent and quality public services. Given the country's commitment to secure its future human capital and the growing importance of its prevention and early intervention agenda, public finance decisions should be deliberate in maintaining the so-called social wage for children. Even though, Mr. Chairperson, we acknowledge that very difficult policy decisions must be made to restore stability to the country's public finances. Whilst it is acknowledged that South Africa has exceedingly high levels of urbanization child poverty has a distinctly rural face. Investment in rural social infrastructure, namely schools and health clinics, must remain top of the government's funding agenda. It is encouraging to note, therefore, that the MTBPS for 2020 indicates that changes to the country's provincial equitable shares formula will now recognize the differences in service delivery costs for rural and urban areas. This is, Mr. Chairperson, a welcome development which UNICEF South Africa supports fully. The special adjusted budget, which was tabled in June 2020, held tremendous promise for children. Not only did the country witness the introduction of top-up grants for children, we also saw the introduction of the first ever COVID-19 grant, which provided immediate relief to thousands of households. The latest NIDS-CRAM results suggest that the social grants are well targeted, they achieve equity, and while they have not prevented hunger in all instances, the evidence is clear that these grants were and are life-saving and vital. The pandemic not only challenges the country's education, health, social protection, and public finance systems, it also helped researchers explore the myth of dependency on social grants as the only form of income for poor and vulnerable South Africans. The NIDS-CRAM research shows that the loss of labor market income not only affected middle-income households, but grant-receiving households were equally hard hit. This places the spotlight on the overall adequacy of the social grants and the realization that social grant income is one of many income streams for poor and vulnerable households. It is therefore vital that households in the lower and middle income deciles find work again, because the alternative, as the research shows, is an expanded list of beneficiaries who qualify for social assistance. As far as the MTBPS 2020 is concerned, there are a number of really encouraging developments for children, Mr. Chairperson, and these include the continued provision of adequate personal protective equipment for educators and a strong commitment to ensure that schools remain safe places with regular cleaning and sanitation facilities. The imminent introduction of school assistance intended to alleviate the administrative burden on educators, thus increasing the actual teaching contact time. I will pass those points in the interest of time and go to the next point. The MTBPS 2020 also presents stark spending choices and proposes to reduce overall non-interest expenditure by more than 300 million rands over the next 3 years. To put this in perspective, the proposed cuts are equivalent to the entire government's expenditure on capital for the next 3 years. By any standard, this level of fiscal adjustment is going to challenge policymakers to continue to deliver the services for our children. And while finding innovative ways of preserving benefits that were taken for granted and, Mr. Chairman, had a positive impact on the child's well-being in the past. What is of concern to us is that provinces which deliver key services in basic education, health, and social development are hard hit and have their unconditional share of national revenue reduced by 4% in real terms on average over the next 3 years. This will require a level of internal trade-offs that will be difficult for most provincial education, health, and social development departments. The intended cuts are largely dependent on the government's trimming of the public sector wage bill, but there are concerns that should this fail, then further and deeper cuts into activities and programs that benefit children today may become unavoidable. The so-called social wage for children will come under severe pressure over the next 3 years, thus further reducing the fiscal space needed to realize children's social and economic rights. Expenditures on basic education is projected to decline in real terms by 3.5% annually for the next 3 years. Expenditure on health is projected to decline by 1.5% in real terms over the same period, while expenditure on social development is projected to decline by 2.2% in real terms over the corresponding period. In the research that we did, that we commissioned and that will be published soon, preliminary results indicate that the government of South Africa has continued to prioritize the fiscal space for children. This is a commendable achievement, but the advent of COVID-19 has changed this overall level of investment, and there are real dangers that the gains made for children during the last 2 decades could be severely challenged, Mr. Chairperson. The introduction of zero-based budgeting practices could potentially help to facilitate some of the trade-offs within and between functions. This could also help to broaden the scope and remit for debate about national and provincial priorities, and instead of being used, as a technical tool only, it could help facilitate sector-wide conversations about how best to approach spending prioritization. UNICEF in South Africa calls therefore on all relevant stakeholders to join the debate on zero-based budgeting to help ensure that core spending on children's services is not negated during the time of fiscal adjustment. In 2018, a UNICEF-sponsored recommendation about unpaid provincial invoices was adopted by the then Joint Appropriations Committee. The MTBPS 2020 continues to warn about the fiscal dangers inherent in unpaid provincial bills and indicates that unpaid bills may ruin and defer planned service delivery spending, which could be disastrous for communities that need these life-saving services. In the context of planned expenditure cuts, unpaid and accumulating spending arrears are clear and present dangers for our children, and the present effort and emphasis placed on this matter by the National Treasury should be commended and further supported, Mr. Chairperson. In view of the present public finance situation represented in the MTBPS 2020, UNICEF in South Africa would like to make the following recommendations. The government should expedite the work on the reform to the provincial equitable shares formula so that rural provinces' needs are taken into account in the distribution of provincial funding. The Appropriation Committee should consider the possible extension of the special relief of distress grant or COVID-19 grant based on new information that emerges about employment and the country's economic growth. The national and provincial executives should accelerate the implementation and monitoring of work on unpaid provincial invoices and National Treasury should report back to Parliament on progress in reducing unpaid provincial invoices in basic education, in health and social development. The national and provincial governments should arrest declines, so stop declines in spending on social infrastructure in basic education and health due to their poverty-inducing effects. And national and provincial government should use the zero budgeting approach in both its technical and democratic senses so that reasonable spending decisions are made with the full input of various stakeholders in and outside of government. Mr. Chairperson, South Africa has continued to lead the world in budget transparency, its willingness to extend social assistance to those most in need, and in the large initial public finance response to address the immediate effects of COVID-19. What we need now is a series of sensible national conversations about the best ways to continue the country's momentum to fight and defeat poverty and inequality in the interest of our children. So I thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute to the ongoing national debates on financing in our case for children, and I wish the committee all the best in its deliberation and final recommendations.
Thank you so much, Christine from UNICEF. Can we take the Western Cape Commissioner for Children? 15 minutes, please, Carmen.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to the committee. The Western Cape Commissioner for Children is a constitutional institution that has oversight over the provincial departments of education, health, social development, sport, and culture. And so as a new institution, in fact, I am the first Commissioner for Children in the history of South Africa. And we really need to do more to create children's rights champions in all parts of the country and on a national level. That's one of the key messages I actually have to share with you today. But let me start my presentation. Key message.
Ma'am, good morning and you are welcome. Please share with us your name again.
Christina Nomdu, the Western Cape Commissioner for Children.
So it's another Christine, eh? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so the key messages with the submission are that the South African government is obliged to ensure children's rights are realized in accordance with the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Our fiscus must confirm our commitment to the rights and well-being of children. Fiscal austerity measures cannot be regressive. Investments in socio-economic rights such as education, health, and social welfare, especially for children, cannot be decreased. There are key levers for change that will optimize our investment in children's lives, similar to that suggested by the Financial and Fiscal Commission in a 2020 report. These are bolstering social welfare services which support the most vulnerable in our society, investing in early childhood development, and ensuring a focus on disadvantaged learners. These are most important opportunities for optimizing child rights realization. It is also important that an oversight mechanism for the realization of child rights is needed that cuts across the sectors and spheres of government. Within Parliament, we would recommend that the technical support could be provided by the Parliamentary Budget Office to prepare an independent technical submission to the Appropriations Committee on the impact of the MTBPS and the budget on children's rights on a regular basis. The key recommendations then are, especially during and after the COVID pandemic, social welfare services should be bolstered as the most vulnerable in society are worst affected by the negative consequences of a national lockdown. The NIDS-CRAM study helped us to understand that 3 million jobs were lost between February and April and had not been regained by June 2020 of this year. The incidence of child hunger was 15% in May, June, but lower than adult hunger at 22%, which suggests that households had tried to protect children from food insecurity. This declined to 11% in July, August 2020, and 16% for adults, still significantly higher than pre-pandemic levels. The second last point before the key recommendation, the special COVID social relief of distress grant, which had reached 6 million additional people, had been extended to January 2020. But the MTBPS announced a termination of the temporary increase in other grants, such as the caregiver allowance to the child support grant. This support to caregivers of the most vulnerable children is fundamental to aid children and families to survive and recover in these extraordinarily hard times. The key recommendation from the office, therefore, is please extend the caregiver grant until February 2021 and increase the CSG to 581 Rand from March 2021 on par with the food poverty line. The next recommendation goes to the early childhood development sector. Early childhood development requires the collaboration of key departments, health, education, and social development. Budget policy must reflect this joint commitment to children in the earliest years of life. I often hear now the rhetoric that early childhood development is being transferred to the Department of Education. This is in fact not true. The collaboration of all three social cluster departments are required to implement the essential care package. And so one must look at support to early childhood development in increases in budgets in health, education, and social development. The NIDSCRAM again helps us to understand that by mid-July to mid-August, a month after ECD programs could reopen, only 13% of children aged 0 to 6 were attending ECD programs, compared to 47% in 2018 before the crisis. The National Minister of Social Development and all the provincial MECs for social development, except in the Western Cape, were ordered to pay 100% of subsidies to ECD centers, whether they were operational or not. This was by the Gauteng High Court. My key recommendation then at the end of this section, if one goes to the next page, is that we continue to allocate budgets in all three key departments as the Department of Education cannot fulfill the entire essential care package for early childhood development. My next recommendation is around disadvantaged learners. Disadvantaged learners need the most financial commitment if we are to decrease poverty and inequality in the longest time. Studies show that a key lever for social mobility is access to education and improved quality of education. So the second last point on this page, which talks to the Accelerated School Infrastructure Delivery Initiative, completed only 2 of the 31 planned school projects projected for 2020-2021 from April to September 2020. Only 4 out of 691 targeted schools were provided with sanitation facilities, and only 3 out of a planned 125 schools were provided with water. So my key recommendation in this regard, and it will come as no surprise because many others have spoken to it, is that we review the decision to reprioritize funds for school infrastructure to the SAA bailout. I really cannot find a reason why we must sacrifice on the rights of children in this respect. My final recommendation is that child socioeconomic rights can be advanced by monitoring government budgets. And this is also recommended by the General Comment 19 of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. And so we feel that the medium-term budget policy statement is a critical juncture to gauge where children's rights are placed on the political and fiscal agenda, and influential policymakers to put the needs of children first before allocations are cast in stone at the next budget. My complete final point in my presentation, which goes right to the end of the presentation, after the analysis, and I must thank here Professor Tanya Ajam, who helped with the budget analysis on this paper. And I would like to say that the analysis concludes for this sample of programs on the aggregate, the sample presented to you in the submission. Resources for children have increased by 14.1%. The explanatory memorandum of the Second Division of Revenue Act indicates that 336 million rand was wired away from the school infrastructure backlog grant to fund the South African Airways bailout. Now, my submission would not be complete if I do not bring the voices of children into this. My office works directly with children to ensure children's rights to participation in all decisions that affect their lives are realized, and especially participation in governance. And so I bring to you the words of Zubair, who is 16 years old. He read the entire MTBPS speech and then said, "Why can't the Minister of Finance write this in a child-friendly manner so that we, the children, can see if the money of the country is being spent on children?" Committee members, everyone present, I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Christine. Can you have this Center for Early Childhood Development? Am I right?
Yes, you are right, Chair.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself. You have 15 minutes to take us through your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chair, and good morning, honourable members. My name is Yusra Ehrenreich, and I'm from the Centre for Early Childhood Development. I'm joined today by my director, Professor Eric Atman. The focus of our submission, our presentation, will be on the medium-term budget policy statement as it relates specifically to early childhood development. First, we will briefly outline our expectation versus the reality of the MTBPS and our reaction to it. Then we will discuss key challenges facing the ECD sector, after which we will propose certain recommendations before we conclude our presentation. Next slide. Thank you. In terms of what we expected from the MTBPS, we understand and agree that the government's priority is to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we welcome the just under 589 million rand that has been allocated in terms of the presidential employment intervention to sustain ECD workers. However, this additional funding does not address the real and ever-present need for adequate government expenditure on ECD services required before COVID-19 and most probably well after this pandemic. The government's prioritization of ECD, which was mentioned in the 2020 February budget, gave us hope that we would see more investment of public funds in the ECD sector in 2020. Next slide. We will now discuss the key challenges facing the ECD sector, which will explain why the ECD sector needs more public funds. To date, ECD services are mainly funded by parents and the private sector, which includes resilient women in our communities who care for those vulnerable children, often depleting their own household income. It includes donors as well as non-profit organizations. And although government's investment in the ECD sector has increased, government still funds very little towards ECD services. In fact, South Africa only spends between 1 to 2% of its total education budget on early learning programs, and roughly 5% of national expenditure is spent on the ECD sector. Next slide, please. This is particularly problematic given the empirical research that shows the earlier you invest in human capital, the greater the return. And this is illustrated by the graph in front of you, where the more money you invest in programs targeted towards the earliest years, the greater the social and economic return in society, compared to moving into formal schooling years and post-schooling years as you move from the dark blue column towards the right-hand side of the graph. Statistics therefore prove that prioritizing ECD as a government strategy is a cost-effective investment with a social and economic return because it builds human capital and it enables future participation in the labor market. Investing in ECD is part of a long-term plan to stimulate the economy in South Africa. Next slide, please. So with the current ECD budget of 75 billion Rand, 67% goes towards primary health care for mothers and children and 27% to childcare grants. Only 6.5% is spent on early learning, nutrition support, responsive parenting, and early intervention. And currently, in terms of that 6.5% spent on the early learning and development elements of ECD services, the main form of government funding is a per-child subsidy paid to center-based programs for children living in poverty, which is determined by an income-based means test. Next slide, please. More specifically, it is only once these ECD centers are registered that they are eligible to apply to access an ECD subsidy, which is currently an amount of 17 Rand per child per day for 264 days, but only for those children whose parents or caregivers pass the income-based means test. And the government intends to move away from the means test for children who attend an ECD center located in a designated municipal ward. Moreover, there is a formula which sets out what proportion of the 17 Rand subsidy must be used for what purpose. So for example, in the Western Cape, 40% of that 17 Rand, that is 6.80 Rand per child per day, must be spent for their nutrition. 40%, which is another 6.80 Rand per child per day, is for the salaries of the staff, and 20%, which is 3.40 Rand per child per day, must be spent on administration and stimulation materials. Next slide. National government also intends to provide funding for non-center-based ECD programs. And under this proposal, once a program is registered, the program will be eligible to access an ECD subsidy of 6 Rand per child per session. And a non-center-based program would be toy libraries, family outreach, or any form of playgroup. These forms of national funding is fundamentally problematic given the statistics in South Africa. Of the roughly 2 million children who receive some form of ECD service, over 75%, that's more than 1.5 million children, are in unregulated and unregistered programs, and 3.2 million children do not access any form of ECD provision. This means that the most vulnerable children are not able to access funding. Other forms of government expenditure on ECD services are limited and ad hoc, and they are usually once-off investments in NPO pilot projects, and they vary from one province to another province. We therefore propose 3 various recommendations, which I'll explain in more detail in the slides to follow. Next slide. Thank you. Our first proposed recommendation relates to the funding of registration of ECD services. Given that the majority of South African children receive ECD services at unregistered ECD centers and unregistered non-center-based programs, such children are not able to access government funding. The focus should then be on ensuring that the ECD centers and the non-center-based ECD programs are registered. We therefore propose that the government provides a ring-fenced conditional grant in support of registering community ECD centers and ECD programs, where the principals at the centers and the ECD program managers can receive the financial assistance which will help them meet the registration requirements in order for them to access the government funding. According to the 2020 AENE, government is providing budgetary funds towards compliance officers and registration officers, but having personnel and institutional capacity is not sufficient. The reality is that many centers and programs do not have the necessary funds to set up properly, and they need the financial assistance to reach the minimum health and safety standards so that they can register in the first place. Next slide. The second recommendation is for both ECD centers and ECD non-center-based programs. The reason being that even once a center or program is registered, the actual amount of the per-child subsidy is not enough for the purpose for which it is used. For ECD centers, we are pleased that the amount has increased from 15 Rand per child per day, but 17 Rand per child per day to spend on nutrition, salaries, administration, and stimulation materials is not nearly enough. Neither is the projected budgetary increase to 17 Rand 77 in 2021 and 18 Rand 57 in 2022. For non-center-based ECD programs, there is no budgetary projection increasing that 6 Rand per child per session. And this is even more worrying given that these programs target the most vulnerable children. They work with children that cannot access the formal ECD center programs, and they're specifically designed to reach that greater number of children who are not in any form of provision. So that's the 3.2 million children. We therefore propose that the amount of the per-child subsidy be based on an accurate estimate of costs in delivering these effective and sustainable centers and non-center-based programs. Next slide, please. Our last proposed recommendation is a call for more specificity in the ECD budget allocations. To operate effective ECD centers and programs, particularly in impoverished areas, requires more support than the per-child subsidy alone. We therefore propose that the government has an ECD specific budget, much like budgets for basic education and higher education and training, where there are distinct programs and or grants dedicated to the learning and development elements of ECD. For example, programs for learning, or grants for infrastructure, for nutrition, children with disabilities, teachers' compensation, etc. This may be served with the function shift that's from DSD to DBE, which we await to see. It is also important for separate funding to be specifically allocated towards center-based ECD services and non-center-based ECD services by national government instead of pooling the two together as an ECD grant. This will create certainty on the amount and the type of ECD services provinces and local government are obliged to fund. And then it also becomes easier when we track government expenditure on these ECD services and the impact thereof. Next slide. In conclusion, we know the provision of ECD services is not government's responsibility alone. And over the last few decades, ECD has been disproportionately funded by parents and the private sector, but ECD services are in dire need of public funding. CECD believes in engagement and wants to assist wherever we can. Not only are the rights to education, primary health care, and basic nutrition fundamental human rights and constitutional rights afforded to all children, but research shows that investment in quality ECD programs for young children, particularly vulnerable young children, has a significant effect on reducing poverty and inequality across society, and therefore this should be prioritized. Thank you very much.
Yusra, thank you so much for the presentation on behalf of Early Childhood Development and your team. Honourable members, Lubabalo, these are the only submissions we're having, right? Oral submissions, am I correct?
You are correct, Chairperson, yes.
Thank you so much. Let me thank all the presenters for eloquent presentations on the subject that they were presenting on. Honourable members, I would request that we indicate those of us who wanted to interact with the presentations. Then I'll direct how the presenters are going to interact with our presentations. Thank you so much, honourable members. Let's see who would like to take the first bite. You'll help me, Babalo.
Yes, Chair. So far, Chairperson, we have Honourable Moletsane.
Just a second, Honourable Moletsane. Come on, honourable members.
Honourable Ryder.
Honourable Ryder.
Honorable Kaiso,
Honorable Kaiso,
Honorable Joseph,
Honorable Joseph, honorable members,
Peters,
Honorable Peters,
Njadu,
Honorable Njadu, is that fine? You'll help me if somebody else comes up, Lubabalo. Honorable members, why don't we try at 3 minutes each? Let's try to compress our questions within 3 minutes. See, I've been very liberal. I gave you one more minute, and then let's see. Then presenters, and please, honorable members, please indicate the presenter that you are directing your question to, so that he or she can note the question and then respond to those questions. I'll then ask Honorable Muletsane to start. Please, Honorable Muletsane, it's your turn.
Thank you, Chairperson. Let me acknowledge the presentations. My first question will go to the author. On their submission, they made a point that spending has been growing as the spending has been growing as has public debt, but services delivered do not represent a good value for money. According to author research, if any, what will be the more specific and concrete steps to be proposed for government to improve services delivered and achieve value for money, given the current capacity of the state? My second question will go to COSATU. On their presentation, they made a point about banning politically exposed persons from state tenders, but we should also agree that it is not all politically exposed persons who are corrupt. My questions will be, what about those that were already doing business with government way before their family members became prominent political members? What about the fact that government has put measures in place, such as disclosure and many other instruments? Are these not adequate to address political influence on state tenders, which will not amount to discrimination? Will this not amount to discrimination of people because of their family members' status in politics? What will be the implications for the people who are employed by their companies, who have families to support, and whose sole income comes from such tenders? Will this not contribute towards the already high unemployment, poverty, and inequalities? Lastly, Chair, my question will go to UNICEF. On their presentation, they said in support to the Department of Basic Education, a total of 120 schools across 7 provinces will receive improved access to hand washing facilities. Now, what I want to know from them, because they are saying, they are talking about 7 provinces. Which 2 provinces are those that are excluded? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Honorable Muletsane. Honorable Writer, please come in.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Yeah, Outer, nice presentation, hard-hitting, enjoyed it, thank you. COSATU, the other Matthew, many good inputs, obviously small ideological differences, but I think you had some excellent points. I wanted to ask about that Eskom social compact. Does that also move into the territory of local government and the big outstanding debt, which obviously has massive effect on vast groups of society? Maybe you can share that compact with us. We can take a look at it. It would be most interesting for me to see, or point me in the direction where I can get it. And I think the loan guarantee scheme, big point that needs highlighting is the fact that it's not working, and there's something that's not working properly there. Something needs to be unblocked. And then I think a general comment I'd like to hear from the other presenters who all had not the same, but you know, we're moving in similar directions and highlighting similar issues. I think again goes to education on the children. We have seen a move towards some funding, some additional funding for ECD projects, which I think has been highlighted and welcomed by most. Just your impressions of, is this a good indication in terms of taking us forward, focusing on ECD first, getting that right, and then moving it further up, or you know, is there a realistic expectation that we could focus across the board at education? Just give us some inputs on that, please, from all of the guys looking at the children, UNICEF, etc. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Ryder. Honorable Kaiso.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me start here with Outa. I just want to understand, Outa, what you made mention of a proposal for the establishment of investigation of hiring practices. I just want to understand, can you just break down that for me to understand? Perhaps I don't want to understand you differently from what you initially thought of. I may think of labor broking or something like that, but I just want to understand what is that hiring practice that you're referring to. Yes, I think this matter of the structure of the local government or the financing model, it has come now and again before this committee, which says that we have to take serious that matter of looking at a new financial model for the local government in future. But I don't think that the issue of the zero rate budgeting is something that has to be rushed into, because I would want to know, for instance, from Outa, how would this financial cycle of zero rating budget is going to operate? Is it going to be January to December? Because currently we're saying it's from the 31st of March to 1st of April. So can you explain how do you see it being operationalized within the budget cycle? Because otherwise I don't think we have to rush it. But on COSATU entirely, there's a number of progressive proposals that we as a committee should agree with on COSATU. You see, Honorable Chair, the issue of job safe, because we can't talk on economic recovery on the other side. The issue of job safe destroys income and promote poverty and hunger. So we're not supposed to talk contradictory to what the economic recovery plan is saying. When other people such as SABC, as a government entity, now talk about job destruction through retrenchment, that it can't be correct, that one. Definitely it's a completely opposite from what is being said from what the government is saying in terms of economic recovery plan. So we can't be talking of retrenchment of workers and now promoting poverty and hunger. It's completely different proposal. And in the midst of all these things, all these problems cannot just be piled up on the responsibility of the government, which has caused the crisis through certain operations. But the issue of economic investment by the private sector actually supposed to come in as well, because they are ones who are actually also contributing towards a decline in the economic growth in the absence of any investment in the country. And on COSATU, just want to understand, thank you, Honorable Chair, just one point to understand from COSATU, what is it, why is it COSATU not saying anything about SA Express workers? Because I believe that they have been swallowed by the hippopotamus, because they are workers, they are also workers as SAA workers. So I'm really wanted to understand that why COSATU doesn't say much about SAA Express workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Honorable Joseph.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you for the stakeholders for their inputs. I think listening to all the stakeholders, Chairperson, I think maybe the committee must meet with the other chairpersons of this the committees that deals with the stakeholders that normally come to our public hearings. It'd be good also if we can engage with the chairpersons of these committees in Parliament and present to them, and that we share information as to how we're going to deal on the way forward. In terms of OTA, I'd just like to know if there's direct communication or interaction with the National Treasury, and if they get feedback besides presenting their proposals to us. And then on COSATU, Chairperson, I support the speed up of the procurement amendment bill. I think we need to really look at that. We can't, I agree, wait 3-4 years for implementation. I support the collective bargaining process. We need, in good faith, and we need to create a stable government and environment to talk into. So the wage bill it's a principal matter, and if the principal matter is addressed, which is unavoidable between government, labor, business, and the unions, then of course we can agree to move forward and find a solution in a stable environment. So I don't think COSATU is running away from it. I think government needs to do it in good faith. Otherwise, we're not creating stability. I also support the question on the SOEs that Mr. Parks raised. There's been an old decision of government, and I think we need reports now. What has happened? What is the progress on reviewing state-owned entities? It's very important. UNICEF Chairperson, the high levels of urbanization, I think I've heard them. It's a concern. I would like to know if they have records of what the trend is and the impact on children on clinics and ECD centers. And then I want to congratulate the commissioner in the Western Cape, Ms. Nomdu. It is, I think, as a result of the Western Cape having a constitution. And I would like to ask her if, and I'm concerned about the drop from 47 to 13% of child support, 0 to 6 years that she raised, is a concern. And I would like to know if she has, in a short term of the new office, established links with other structures in the country that deals with issues of children, because the Western Cape is not an island; it is part of South Africa. And then the last point, Chairperson, the Center for ECDs, Ms. Ehrenreich, also the 3.2 million not covered because they're unregistered or unregulated. It is a big concern. And my question to her is, as they presented this information to social development, the department itself, and what is their view, so that we can hear how they understand the department's vision on their and proposals to move forward on their concerns. Thank you very much, Chairperson, for the opportunity.
Honorable Peters, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. And I want to also take this opportunity to thank all the presenters this morning. I think if you look at the previous presentations from some of these presenters, Chairperson, you would also realize the consistency for which they have been actually coming before this committee. So I would truly support their call, and also the call of this committee for over time, like you indicated to the previous presenters who were here, that the time that we get allocated to engage with this particular process is very little or limited, and we need to have more time. Like Honorable Joseph and other members have already spoken, I would also want to know if these stakeholders have had an opportunity to engage with the parliamentary portfolio committees that are directly responsible, like, for example, your social development with regard to children, as well as basic education, and including health, because I believe that their inputs are very key and important. And I'm happy to also say that the presentation by COSATU has been very consistent. And I'm happy that COSATU is coming up with recommendations, especially with regard to the issues related to the wage bill, but also the social compact or the partnership that will be signed very soon through NETLEC. That for me is an indication of not just sitting and criticizing, but also bringing up alternatives. The Honorable Joseph has taken my question with regard to whether the Commissioner for Children in the Western Cape is working together with other stakeholders in other provinces. And I heard Honorable Joseph saying it's because they have a constitution. I don't believe that it's the main reason for this. We need not to be competing. South Africa is one. There are children who live in Gauteng who come to the Western Cape, who live in the Western Cape, who go to other provinces like Eastern Cape, as well as other provinces like the Northern Cape. So the standard that gets applied for our children must be uniform standard. The other thing is, with regard to the wage bill, I just want to understand from outer, how do they suggest that going forward, this matter of the wage bill must be addressed? And I'm happy that UNICEF and others have also spoken to this, but came up with indications that the key service delivery areas would be the ones that get affected, because usually when we talk about reduction, the reductions happen in that particular area. Honorable Kaiso has taken my main question, which is related to what is COSATU saying with regard to SA Express workers, SAPC workers, and other workers in other sectors that are equally affected by the reductions, but also the possible retrenchment throughout the country. Even in the private sector, there are workers that are going to be affected. So I think it is important that when we speak to the issues of the workers at SAA, we should also be talking, because equally so express workers are from the SOE or SOC, and also reporting, as Express was reporting to TPE. As we speak, we've got workers who have not been paid since March, and whose pensions are affected, and all those type of areas. So I think it is important that we get to know from okay, Outer says the public procurement bill does not address transparency. I want to find out if Outer did make their presentation or their input into the public hearing processes of the Portfolio Committee of Finance, and what has been the engagements even at the time the bill was publicized for public comment, whether Outer did make their inputs. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Some of my points have really been taken, and that is a disadvantage of speaking at the end. Thank you, Chair.
Is it not an advantage, Honorable Peters? Honorable Jadu, please come in.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Chair and members. Let me take it as an advantage, Chair. Okay, Chairperson. After the, let me also use this opportunity to welcome all the presentations. And Chair, my first take will be to say that I think going forward, I will encourage that maybe we as the finance and the appropriation committees to moving forward that all departments to have engagements with the relevant stakeholders. For example, where the presentations are speaking to certain departments, so that direct engagements also be there. So that will make, I think, an impact directly to the departments, so that when we as a finance and the appropriations get these presentations, so that all the departments who are affected are also having these presentations for their own. Chairperson, quickly to say that OUTA, my questions will be to OUTA and COSATU, and I would want more clarity and explanation from OUTA on to say that according to OUTA, what will be other funding sources that would have been used by government other than shifting funds from national, provincial, and or local government. Just to give more explanation as to other funds, resources, other than shifting those funds from those national and provincial and or local government. Then, Chairperson, the second one is that in terms of outer choices within programs that could be considered to economic enablers being reprioritized. Now, my question is that what are those specific programs, and how will this reprioritization be done? What criteria could be more effective in order to strike a balance? Those are two questions to OUTA. And then COSATU, Chair, let me comment COSATU, because COSATU is always there for also be part of solutions, which is welcome and appreciated. But my one question to COSATU is to say that what could be the impact or attracting more experience and much needed scarce expertise as to with the already existing lack of capacity in government departments, just to give an understanding as to how can we retain and attract more experience and expertise in terms of the current challenges that we are sitting with. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Njadu. Did I leave any honorable member out?
Chair, the Honorable Karim, Chair.
Come again?
Honorable Karim, Chairperson.
Okay. Is the other one?
Sorry.
Honorable Karim, please come in.
Thank you very much. Firstly, Chairperson, I'm sure you're going to agree. It echoes what you said earlier at the end of the first two submissions. That look, I think most of us, Comrade Chair, who amongst us, well, maybe one or two people, but most of us really are fine what the submissions have to offer in the way of, goals, what they want to achieve. I mean, like, who can deny the value of what most of these recommendations have to offer? I mean, an early childhood development and so on. I mean, many of these, in fact, almost all, if not all of the submissions are doing very good work, as you said, Chairperson. I think we really need to respect them and commend them without patronizing them. They need to engage with us quite robustly and confrontationally where they have to, but also engage with us in a cooperative way where it's necessary. We are in a very perilous situation, unprecedented situation. And, if we could, we would implement almost all the recommendations. The difficulty, though, Chairperson, is I don't think we do enough to communicate with civil society stakeholders the constraints within which we operate. Wherever we are on the ideological spectrum in this committee, or even within the party you and I come from, what is utterly clear, and the former deputy minister, you would know even more than me, we have no money, basically. So when we say trade-offs, people rightly say, well, what about corruption? What about mismanagement? What about illicit financial flows? What about salary cuts, etc.? All of that is correct. But to imagine that in the next 3 to 5 years, or 3 years for first MTEF phase we're talking about, that we're going to be able to put in prison all the people who've been looting and actually get money back, even if we put them in prison. It's going to cost us more. Not that we shouldn't do it to have these people in prison. So many they are. Only this morning, our newspaper here, locally, Msandusi's Natal Witness has got a banner there that says 100 more people arrested for fraud in SSA. So what we are saying is, in short, we agree with them. But if they were in our position, Comrade Chair, they would be stuck with the despicable trade-offs we have to make. And if we were in their position, we will be saying very much more or less the same things. So when I speak of trade-offs, we need more concrete sort of advice and so on. Secondly, on the matter of having more time. Chairperson, this has been discussed ad nauseum since 2014. You came into the committee in 2017, and so on. You know the difficulties. We tried to amend the Money Bills Act. This part of the year, sadly, is very difficult because if we don't finish, then Parliament is extending these terms into our constituency December period. But that we have to do. Finally, I like what Comrade Njadu is saying. We've said it before. You see, we need to, as MPs, put enormous pressure on Treasury and other departments to engage more with the stakeholders in those respective departments, Chairperson. You see, the departments get away with too much. Treasury is more consultative than is made out in these hearings, certainly. I mean, I can see it in the tax bills, and you know it, you were there. But it's certainly less consultative than it needs to be. Now, that's another area, Comrade Chair. You see, finally, we should ask Treasury, tell us in full detail, when they present the MTBPS, the DG must do it. What level of consultation have you had? Okay, COVID set certain difficulties this time, Chairperson, but I think we must make it a precondition. Before we take on the MTBPS or the budget, we want them to give us a full explanation. How much did you consult? It's not co-determination. Elected politicians ultimately must decide. Nobody wants to pay taxes, as we were saying yesterday, Chairperson. There are many trade-offs that government does, which sector-driven. You see, like early child development, excellent work. But their perspective is solely and understandably, you and I will do the same, focusing on early childhood development. Sometimes we have to put money elsewhere to grow the economy, whose effects will ultimately be to benefit the children too. But in the immediate term, it seemed like we are trading off between children and the needs of the broader issues. I think I've gone on more than I should have, Chairperson. You've been very indulgent. Sorry about that. It's just that each time we come to the space where your empathy and moral sort of identification is with the stakeholders, but as MPs, you're stuck. You know, that these are the dreadful choices you have to make. But on the issue, Chairperson, I'm thinking more and more about it. Can we discuss this offline as the four chairs? We must insist that Treasury, and we call other departments and did you consult, etc. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, Honorable Karim, the experience that you were sharing with us, and some of the things that need to be done as a response to these public hearings, because you remember that we said at the beginning we don't want to be involved in a tick box type of a situation just to comply with the Money Bills Act. I think that will discourage the public from participating. Another point that I mentioned, which I also took from you in your earlier life, when you were still much younger, was the
point of order.
Is the question of making this process not an elitist process. How do we ensure that people from some areas where, for instance, they can't fly in, they don't have connectivity that we are having, that they also participate in this process? These are the things that we must put on our to-do list so that we can see, obviously, add to that the degree of consultation, both by National Treasury. I know that they are quite stretched, as you know, that a lot of things will always be referred to them. But there's this one can be traded off for anything. There should be that process. But also, I think I wanted to suggest this one, that as MPs, particularly from these finance committees, because we get confronted by these things every time we must deal with the budget one way or the other. I think we need to get both the political leadership and the administrative leadership, we as these committees, and then we just engage in this type of a discussion and share with them some of the frustrations that are not just coming from us as politicians, but also frustrations coming from the members of civil society. As you know, there are regulars here, and they've raised some of the issues. And as you are saying, what you agree, we may be seen not to be moving on those issues, or at least responding as satisfactory as to say, why are we not doing certain things? So I think there is as one of the things, and I think we need to do it even outside the budgetary process, right? Okay, let's get them, let's engage so that we can share with them some of these experiences. But let me come to my questions. Outer, and this again goes to COSATU about the regionalization of PRASA. I'm not sure whether you are aware that there's so much cross-subsidization of commuter rail, that there are dense lines. For instance, if you come to the Western Cape, right, the patronage of commuter rail it's very high. If you go to Durban, the KwaMashu Umlazi route, very much dense. Again, if you go to Gauteng, there are those lines. But there are many other lines, for instance, where people also depend on commuter rail. If you go, for instance, in the Eastern Cape, not too much patronage as you get in the areas that I mentioned. So the question I just wanted to say, are you aware that there's this cross-subsidization? And the studies which are there is that if you were to regionalize or provincialize PRASA, it will result in a lot of, again, in deepening the marginalization, which is also economic marginalization of certain provinces. And then I wanted to make this comment, and any of the presenters can comment. Out there, there's a state capture inquiries, and now there's this thing that anyone who doesn't want to, who's not performing these days, just blame it on state capture. Everyone wants to be corrupt. The first thing you must say in your introduction is that I'm dealing with massive state capture. Then you're allowed to be corrupt after that. There's this statement. I would like to hear your comment. In fact, people even go out and say there's so much corruption taking place now, and we may find ourselves having to deal with state capture too, corruption which took place during the period of state capture inquiry one. I think we when it comes to SAA, again, points have been made about the workers of SAA and the debt that SAA have, and take it further than that, when people look at SAA, they don't look at the service industries which sustain SAA and the workers who are there. Have you looked at the implications of closing SAA, not just directly on SAA, but indirectly on those industries which are supported by SAA? For instance, if you were to take the petroleum industry, SAA, there's so much that goes there and so on, and you can go on and on. But what's your comment on that one? I think I want to leave at its outer and COSATU. Problems at SARS, I think we raised this point. Are they only, and this is COSATU, are they only resources based? Is it only money? And then once we pour in money, they do think that the problems at SARS, they'll be able to deal with illicit financial flow, they'll be able to deal with base erosion and profit shifting, they'll be able to deal with under invoicing. Aren't we being superficial in analyzing the problems there? You also talk about the centralization of public procurement, COSATU. Have you looked at the impact of that in the provinces? For instance, regional development, as we have said, that we need to use state procurement to try and deal with economic growth. What do you think the impact of that will be? Again, there's always an assumption that corruption is only in the provinces and local government. Once we put into, aren't we running a risk of centralizing corruption in the process? There's a again about the public procurement bill. Has COSATU had an opportunity? We always say the bill must come to Parliament, but have you looked at what is contained in that procurement bill critically? There's criticism too, which goes to COSATU, who says that COSATU is we don't hear the voice of COSATU when it comes to business corruption and the non-compliance of executives or some of the SOEs. For instance, there are situations where some executives in some of the SOEs which we have bailed out, they've been found that they've been involved in discussing and changing the procurement from companies where they hold interest. But people out there, they say, we don't hear what COSATU is saying about. Do you think that's a fair comment? I think let me leave it at that, and I'll allow the responses, starting with from where we started. I think we started with outer, and that's please you take up what you think is relevant to you. We'll be giving you 10 minutes. Let's start.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you very much for all the questions. I think they're really fantastic. Honorable Moletsane asked about spending growing public debt, but what concrete and specific steps can be taken to achieve value for money given current capacity of the state? So it's a very broad question, Chairperson, honorable members, but I think we've put some of these answers forward. The current capacity of the state is not adequate. I think if that's implicit in the question, I agree very much. We really think that there needs to be consequences for underperformance. And I'll get to your questions, Chairperson, but I agree this underperformance is not only corruption, and wastage of money is not only corruption, but we think that there needs to be consequences for underperformance of state officials and public servants, specifically because those constitute a very big portion of overall expenditure. And he also asked, is disclosure of interest not enough to regulate politically connected people doing business with the state? No, it most certainly is not. It relates to Honorable Karim's point of transparency. And transparency doesn't necessarily mean accountability. There's a big difference, Chairperson. We think that it would be perfectly fair to expect higher ethical standards from public servants, in particular those in powerful political positions who are highly connected. Honorable Ryder, you asked the question whether there should be across the board increased allocations to education or just ECD. I think the graph presented by others who are more competent on this indicates that it would be a better investment to focus on ECD and then go to the rest of education. But overall, education is much more important than, for example, SAA. Honorable Kaisa established an investigation into hiring practices. What exactly are we referring to? So I was referring in particular to those institutions that were really critical in preventing corruption, preventing misspending. We have noticed that part of the state capture agenda was to really hollow out institutions like the National Prosecuting Authority, like SARS, and to really appoint people who were not fit for those positions, who actually facilitated corruption and ensured that there were no consequences for it as it happened. We think that there needs to be an investigation into those kinds of institutions in particular to make sure that there are consequences and that those people are removed and that people who are really well qualified and pass a certain threshold of ethical standards are put into those important positions. On the restructuring of local government, You said that's important, but let's not rush into zero-based budgeting. What about the cycle? Where will it be operationalized within the budget cycle? And thank you, that's a very good question. It's not one that I presume to be able to answer. But as I suggested, I think the FFC and the PBO must come to these committees and really give their proposals for how that should work. But National Treasury as well. We put the question to them in the finance hearings on the fiscal framework. We got no answer. But I pose the question, as you're posing it now to me, how will this be operationalized and who will be responsible? But in terms of the budget cycle in general, I think it's something that needs to change. In particular, how there is public participation, how feedback from departments really gets slotted into the next year's budget. As we're seeing right now, and I mean, it's been noted this is a consequence of the pandemic, but there is not adequate translation of expenditure outcomes to the next year's budget and changes to that budget relative to the current year. That's the whole principle of zero-based budgeting. And we think civil society and ordinary people who actually are supposed to benefit from the spending in municipalities and in provinces, they can give a good picture to whoever is going to make those decisions to say, look, this program of expenditure, particularly in my area, is not working. The money is being wasted. We don't know where it's going, but it's going to the wrong place. So again, in terms of my request to these committees to please reconsider the public participation model, in particular in terms of timeframes and how that relates to National Treasury's timeframes of decision making. That needs to be reviewed. Honorable Joseph, you asked whether we have direct communication with National Treasury and do we get feedback. So the short answer is no, but we attempt to, and we do on particular issues, for example, on our work that we're trying to do on improving the system of local government and its finances. There are some dedicated people in National Treasury who come back to us, who we engage with quite frequently. But for example, the Auditor General's office has been much more responsive, much more engaging, much more appreciative of the value add that civil society and ordinary people can provide to give government a picture of whether the money they spend actually translates into benefits for their daily lives. So I think it would be very welcome for us, and I think for all stakeholders, if these committees can ask National Treasury to improve their participation processes, even though they exist, but to enhance them. Honorable Peters said you agree with the time that's too limited and asked whether we get to engage with portfolio committees who are responsible for sector-specific oversight. And thank you, that's such a good question. The answer is no. We understand that the budget review and recommendations process is supposed to be inclusive. We've studied Parliament's policies in that regard, and it's not forthcoming. There is no participation process. We've tried to proactively engage, to send submissions to say, look, this is what we're going to engage with the appropriations committees on. Please, would you consider the subsection that's relevant to you? But we get no joy. We get no response whatsoever. And there's no consequence for that. And you asked, how must the wage bill issue be addressed? Reductions usually apply to frontline staff in education and health and so forth. Well then, Honorable Peters, I would really put it to you that the reductions are then not happening in the correct way. We do not agree that that is how the wage bill should be reduced. I'd rather agree with the previous speakers who said that it must be a differential approach, as I've said, that those earning very high amounts of money, they must be cut, that those who do not perform, if there are proper performance measurement systems in place, that those salaries must be cut, or those positions must be removed entirely. When we're thinking of the restructuring of local government and the consolidation of some municipalities into a district, there can also be certain redundancies. But as Mr. Parks has said, in all these things, in all these retrenchments and in the restructuring of ESCOM, for example, there must be provision for these people. People cannot simply be left behind. People can be reskilled and placed into positions of public service that are actually useful, that we need in programs that have been fruitful rather than those that are wasteful. And on the procurement bill, yes, we did make inputs to National Treasury directly. We did appraise that bill, we analyzed it, and we put our comment to them. We're waiting for it to be tabled in Parliament to understand whether we've had an impact, and we'll decide on our way forward accordingly. Honorable Njadu, funding sources other than shifting funds. I think the proceeds of financial mismanagement and corruption is an obvious answer that everyone has put, but we agree that this is an adequate source of funding, reprioritization. The question is, how does that reprioritization happen and on what basis? And you asked about what criteria can be used. And that's precisely the point we're putting. I think the Auditor General's office offers very good answers to that question. They would say that there are obvious areas, obvious and specific programs that have been unproductive, that have been consistently underperforming, and that do not satisfy audit requirements. Honorable Karim, you always say trade-offs must be more specific. I understand. And I very much welcome the suggestion that these committees must put more pressure on departments to engage. We would love that. We would appreciate that. We come to Parliament always with these complaints and suggestions precisely because this is the institution that represents us, the people, and departments don't really think that way. We haven't seen them being willing to engage with us at all, in particular when it comes to money and how they spend money. Honorable Buthelezi, he said this cannot be an elitist process, and I completely agree. If there can be engagement with political leaders, I've requested the same thing from Honorable Karim and Maswangani. We need to get some sort of feedback from them, even if it's indirectly through you, because we have no avenue to engage with the leaders at that level. This is our avenue. This is our only chance. On the regionalization of PRASA, are we aware of cross-subsidization? Yes. And would this further marginalize poor provinces if the system were regionalized? I think it's an important question, but it relates to the recommendation from UNICEF that there must be a review of the provincial equitable share formula to really enhance the share that rural provinces get. And in instances where things become more regionalized, as with the district development model, I think it would be only fair if rural provinces were not considered and treated the same way as more urban provinces that generally generate more of their own revenue. And finally, is underperformance always state capture corruption? Absolutely not. In the previous session, again on the fiscal framework, someone said from Treasury that, look, a lot of misspending that we see from the Auditor General's reports, it's just irregular. It's not necessarily corrupt. And we find that this is still unacceptable. And that is money that is spent outside the prescripts of public finance management law. And the knock-on effects of closing SAA, Chairperson, I would argue that the knock-on effects of keeping it open for the past 10 years has been much more dire, much more serious on the public. Thank you.
Come in, colleagues. Is Kosatu? Kosatu, please come in.
Thanks very much, Comrade Chair, and thanks to the members for the questions. I'll try to be brief because I know time is against me. So I think Honorable Molitani, around our proposal as COSATU, in fact, it's no longer just a COSATU proposal, but other trade union federations and business and NELEC have endorsed it, to ban politically exposed persons from doing business with the state. Basically, Chair, our point is that we have a pandemic of corruption, which is eating out at the heart of the state. Workers are now paying the price for it. The existing laws are clearly insufficient given the constant allegations of corruption, and very few people have been held to account. In fact, only one politician has gone to prison in the Northern Cape, nowhere else in the country. Chair, we are bleeding as a state. So we have simply said, can we build upon two existing laws which are already in place? One is that public servants, you would know, are banned from doing business with the state. We said, can we extend that to politicians and to their spouses and children? And you'd also know that members of cabinet, MECs are already not allowed to do business with the state. So simply it's extending it. It's a very small pool of people. We know it won't solve all corruption, but it's a useful gesture to rebuild confidence of the public in the state. But I think what has been alarming for us, Comrade Chair, is the amount of resistance from politicians. And people have a choice. Do they want to go into politics or do they want to be business people? We're not saying that children or the wives or husbands can't do business, but when the partners are ministers, they should do business with the private sector. We can't have a situation where, as we saw in the PPEs, that children of NEC members who had never once produced one single mask overnight became business persons and got tenders for 100 million rand plus, and then delivered poor quality PPEs, which condemned and put the lives of nurses and doctors at risk, thinking they had been protected. So we have a choice. We have received legal opinion, which we'd be happy to share with colleagues, from one of the most eminent legal professors in the country, which saying it is constitutional to limit rights, it is fair, it's rational. And I think government must come to the party to say, what are they doing to address corruption? Because to defend the self-interest of a few at the expense of a majority is not sustainable or moral. Chair, to Honourable Ryder around the Eskom Social Compact and also Honourable Peters, we'll be happy to share it. It does specifically deal with local government debt because we cannot afford to mobilize financial support for Eskom if municipalities are still going to be allowed to owe about 37 billion rand worth of debt to Eskom. That has to be addressed. Everyone must pay, wherever you are, whoever you are. And I think we must actually move to a space where we actually all pay Eskom directly to ensure it has constant cash flow, because bailouts are not sustainable. Equally, Comrade Chair, our Eskom Social Compact also specifically says the role of private sector corruption, the role of wasteful expenditure must be tackled. Honourable Ryder, around the loan guarantee scheme, our latest report we received on it is that only 16 billion rand has been dispersed, that's 8%. Since July, there have been no additional measures by the banks or by Treasury to address it. Basically, we've had countless engagements, and despite the public announcements by the President, by the Minister, there's been no additional interventions by government to fix it, and to be honest, it's dying. And government doesn't seem concerned.
Just, Matthew, just this, allow me to interrupt you because I want you to deal with this one. Do you think that the SO is not the DFIs now? The SO is their businesses themselves. And for instance, if you look at SAPC, if you look at the credit guarantee scheme that you are talking about, it has got better terms for the loans. Do you think that they should also have access to that money rather than only depending on your usual debt and so on and so forth? Please, as you deal with this.
No, thanks, Comrade Chair. Look, exactly, that's one of our proposals to allow the DFIs to be distributors of the loan guarantee scheme. The Minister of Finance had indicated some appetite for that, I think, in July already, but they've not moved with 1 inch, Chair. So we think it's a useful tool to bring competition to the banking sector, so you don't just have the banks sitting on their narrow self-profit motives. Allow the DFIs to come to the party. They are registered financial role players. Allow the Post Bank, for example, to come on board. But to date, they've not done it. And in fact, from my understanding, Comrade Chair, most of the loan guarantee scheme that's been dispersed has been dispersed by one bank in the private sector alone. The other banks themselves have been sitting on the sideline, not moving. The consequence, Comrade Chair, is that companies are closing, workers will lose their jobs. The scheme may not be perfect, no doubt. Let's come with what just to fix it, what are alternatives. But to simply keep quiet, it means we're condemning workers and companies to go under. Comrade Chair, to Honourable Paiso and Peters around SOEs. Look, I think we've made countless issues around as COSATU and our affiliates. So at SABC, Communications Workers Union has been involved. In SAA and SA Express, SATAWU, NTM, our transport unions have been involved. I think for us, Comrade Chair, is a couple of principles. One is there must be clear roadmaps to save these SOEs. All of these SOEs until 10 years ago were sustainable, were profitable. What happened is that they were mismanaged, they were looted by people inside and outside the state, and there's been structural changes in the economy, so they need to be given clear roadmaps, repositioned, refinanced, and given support. And that's what we did with the Eskom Social Compact, Comrade Chair, that what can we do as government, as business, as labor to save these SOEs? But simply retrenching workers and treating them like chess pieces who don't have children is inhumane. If you need to reduce the headcount, let's look at a job transition plan for those workers, but not simply to throw 1,500 SA Express workers or 10,000 SAA workers or 3,000 SABC workers onto the bus. And again, Chair, it's not just there. SACWA, the Qualifications Authority, has been retrenching. The CSI has been retrenching. Transit wants to retrench. If we hadn't intervened at Eskom, the previous leadership there was also going to retrench huge amounts of workers. So I think Honorable Faisu was right, Chair. We must come with alternatives. Chair, to Honorable Joseph around the public procurement bill, we were shocked, Comrade Chair, that Treasury wants another 2 years on this bill. This despite it being on the oven pipeline for 5 years plus. We had raised it a year ago with the President, and it's just unbelievable. And we've seen this pattern throughout, Comrade Chair. Bills that have been passed by Parliament, like the PIC Amendment Bill, which was passed in March last year, it hasn't been signed by government or the President. The Political Party Funding Act was signed by the President, but government has not enacted to say when is it coming to effect. There's been other laws like the UF Amendment Act, the ESTA Amendment Act, which have been signed by the President, not implemented. So there's a new growing unconstitutional precedence where government is undermining Parliament by ignoring laws. Chair, on the collective bargaining, equally, Chair, we feel that collective bargaining is in the Constitution, but you're finding government is undermining it by reneging on it and not engaging workers. Treasury wrote to SALGA to say the municipalities must also walk away from the signed agreement. Fortunately, they refused. Chair, I think for our citizens unions, we're always keen to engage. We know there'll be give and takes, but government must come and engage to find resolutions. But simply going to Parliament and saying this is the wage agreement for the next 4 years with no engagements, it undermines collective bargaining. Equally, Chair, it's difficult for us to sell a compromise to a police officer or a nurse or a teacher who has been exposed to corona, has been working hard, when they don't see cuts on top. They don't see the Minister of Finance saying, I'm going to reduce my wage by 30%. I'm going to forgo the free cars, the free housing, etc. And this is why COSATU is now referring government to the ILO to say it's undermining the own collective agreements it's signed, and why there'll be a COSATU march to union buildings next week to force government to engage. Comrade Chair, we've had lots of engagements with government, and I must be honest with you, it's very frustrating. Often it feels at times like you're talking to yourself. We know government doesn't have to do everything we say, sure, but often at times there is a frustration. But I think Honorable Karim is right. We have seen a greater effort by Treasury, especially in the 5th Parliament, to respond to issues, and I think they will try to acknowledge when the government has been engaging with us. Chair, I think the private sector retrenchment issue of Honorable Peters, many of our affiliates in the collective bargainings in the sectors have been looking at ways to stem the tide of job losses. That is also why we pushed for what will probably be about 60 billion rand to be released from the UIF to prevent job losses. That is workers' money to try to save those companies and those jobs. We've looked at other alternatives in the different bargaining councils. Can the wage gap be reduced? Can we allow pension contribution holidays for employers for a year or 2 years to save these jobs in companies? Can we look at reduced time, which is provided for under the UIF Act? That's also what have motivated many of our proposals to the Economic Recovery Plan. We've developed a toolkit to train shop stewards about looking at alternatives and even how to assist those companies to be sustainable. And because we're all in the boat together, Comrade Chair. But company leadership also has to lead from the front. There was a CEO of a major retailer who got paid 77 million rand the other day, yet he had cost that company significant costs in mismanagement. Those workers in that company didn't get increases or performance bonuses, yet the PIC is the largest shareholder in that retail company. So I think there's also a duty for the pension funds, the PIC, to play a far greater role in holding these companies to account, because it's workers' monies that are sustaining them. I'll try to move quickly, Comrade Chair, to Honorable Njadu. Look, we're going to see a brain drain flight from the public service. If you impose a 4-year wage freeze, which is in effect a cut of 20% after inflation for 4 years, you will see skilled jobs being lost, like nurses and teachers and doctors. They'll be gone. They'll go to Dubai, etc. And that's going to undermine the capacity of the state. I would agree with Honorable Karim about his analysis that we're in a perilous situation. 500%. That's what had motivated us as COSATU to develop our economic intervention proposals to the leadership of the country last year. Our ESCOM social compact, our UIF 60 billion rand. Even what is motivating us, Comrade Chair, to say let's tap into unclaimed pensions to support economic growth. We support Comrade Mboweni around Regulation 28 to unlock investments in infrastructure. That's what had motivated us around a pension limited withdrawals proposal that Comrade Minister has agreed to. That's even why we've come up with proposals around the wage bill for the next 3-year agreement. But we're saying, Comrade Chair, this is what workers are putting on the table, hundreds of billions of rands. What is government private sector putting on the table? They can't simply sit on the sidelines. It can't be workers alone who carry the burden of the state. I think, Comrade Chair, the last honourable member who put him in the spotlight is the Honourable Shenge. So I must give him special, I must behave with him, otherwise he'll deal with me. No, Comrade Chair, I think on the PRASA issue, we wouldn't support transferring to provincial government. I think that would be a mistake. It's a critical national entity and has to be fixed. We're hopeful that the Honourable Minister in Mbalula is fixing it. It is quite alarming that they have got billions of rands unspent there, yet PRASA is bleeding. It is a critical tool. And it also, Chair, it's a management failure that no security was put in place, despite assurances to us that it had been, to prevent the stripping of the railway lines. The fact that at Langa Station in Cape Town, you have an informal settlement now built across the train tracks. It shows you the management failures and it has to be dealt with. You're right, Comrade Chair, you can't blame state capture alone for mismanagement. What is PRASA's excuse for allowing the trains to be stripped when it's a very easy asset to protect? What is the excuse of government to show lethargy on many prosecutions, etc.? So we think government has to build a political accountability. Honourable Chair, your point about the aviation sector is what has motivated us. One, the SAA group, SA Express, is a critical conduit for the aviation sector. Also for tourism internationally. Tourism is one of our largest and potentially greatest economic sectors. And there are good pockets of excellence in SAA. SAA Technical can be rebuilt. Mango has done very well over the years, Air Chefs, etc. And look, Chair, there are 11,500 workers and families on the line. So there has to be a roadmap, but it needs to be fast-tracked. Comrade Chair, just getting to the very end, around SARS, we met with the Commissioner yesterday. I think there is some good work there, but much more needs to be done. We can't understand why would we cut funding for it when there's a need to ramp it up, to rebuild it. And there are huge gaps there, Comrade Chair. The fact that only 5% of goods coming through our ports of entry are inspected for customs duties is inexplicable. There has been some good work around addressing the clothing industry illicit flows, but you would have seen in motor manufacturing, in sugar, and many other sectors, there's a need to deal with customs evasion. There's a need to ensure the informal sector pays the taxes. There's a need to deal with corporate tax evasion, and also to look at what wealth taxes could you introduce next year. But Chair, we've made a proposal that you could even deploy surplus personnel from the Defence Force to SARS, to Customs, to rebuild it. But government has to move with speed to support it. A proposal, Comrade Chair, on central procurement in the state, and I understand your point, is that just for certain large items should be centrally procured, like textbooks, like PPEs, because you can affect the scales of commodity there, save money for the state. But also many municipalities don't have expertise to know what quality PPEs are required. They'll buy cheap imports from China. It also does help to reduce the scope for corruption. But I'm saying just on certain large items, not on every single item, Comrade Chair, because you also don't want to hamstring provincial local governments. We've made a submission, Comrade Chair, which I can share with members around the public procurement bill. We don't think it goes far enough. It needs to be more bold. And given, again, the public procurement is a very weak point in the state and for corruption. I think, Comrade Chair, your last point about private sector corruption, I think we would agree that we've not done enough around exposing private sector corruption. Often workers are scared to expose it because they'll be dismissed afterwards. But we need to fight that culture. Many of our affiliates have done a lot of work to expose corruption, the SOEs and the entities, for example, Nahawu, etc. But I think more needs to be done, and because workers' jobs depend upon it. But equally, Comrade Chair, government has to play its role and the private sector too has to play its role. But let me stop there, Chair. I've definitely far exceeded your generous time allocation, but thank you.
Thank you. Is it Christine, UNICEF?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. In the interest of time, there was one specific question to UNICEF from Honorable Moletsane, and then two general comments. And I'm going to ask my colleague Russell Witherman to take it all together so we don't take too much of the committee's time. Russell, over to you.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Chairperson Buthelezi. There was a question from Honorable Moletsane about the two provinces that were excluded. I think it's Northern Cape and Northwest. No specific reasons for the exclusion. other than the fact that, these are resources limitations. The United Nations is at the start of its new cycle with the South African government and will try its best to fit into the district development model and priority areas outlined by the South African government. And so there's no need why Northwest and Northern Cape would be excluded in further efforts that we will try to do. Then in terms of Honorable Ryder's question about the trade-off between ECD and basic education, the spend on ECD is not that much, so there's significant space for ECD to grow. In fact, ECD, through a new fiscal space paper that we are working on and that we've commissioned, we will release it soon and actually share with the relevant committees, including this particular committee. ECD has been growing off a fairly small base, low base. The key question, I think, at this point in time would be the upper echelons of the basic education system. Those children or those young adults who are now ready to be moved into the higher education system, because post-COVID-19, there would be a need for the country to actually have a kickstart for the economy to be turned around. And therefore, there isn't really that much of a trade-off between ECD, which we don't really spend that much on at this point in time, and the higher echelons of basic education. So I think both can be done at the same time without necessarily being unrealistic about what needs to be spent. Honorable Joseph, on your question on urbanization, the Financial and Fiscal Commission estimated that in 2017, 2018, about 62% of us in this country live in urban areas. It's projected that by 2030, 70% of us will be living in urban areas. And one of the challenges or the conundrums that the FFC tried to address was basically asking this question: if the bulk of us are coming to the cities, and if the rural areas are being depopulated, what does it mean in terms of a funding model? And I think this is the kind of question that the National Treasury is presently struggling with in terms of revising the provincial equitable share, because they've got to find the right balance between recognizing that rural areas are in need of additional investment, but also recognizing that most of us are actually coming to live in the cities. So it's a very fine balancing act, and we would love to see how that particular tension or contradiction will be sorted out. Because I'm often reminded of some of the more urban provinces that will say to you, in 1 year, our infrastructure budget goes up quite substantially, but because of lack of inward migration, the next year, we have to sort of drop it by significant percentages. So difficult to estimate sometimes. And then just finally, a wonderful thanks, I think, on behalf of Christine, to this committee about your efforts to hear, even though you hear so-called sectoral presentations, because in our case, we try not to make a sectoral presentation. We try to emphasize the underlying issues, for example, around the provincial equitable share, or around, for example, the fact that zero-based budgeting should not just be a technical exercise, but should be used to draw in people in terms of making important or helping the government to make important decisions around spending and so on and so on. We accept the point about sectoral committee presentations, but this is the clearinghouse in Parliament for all of these appropriations decisions. And I think we will continue to come to this committee and then always embed a particular public finance angle in our presentation. So at this point, I think I'm giving back to the committee chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you, UNICEF. Can I have the other Christine coming in? Christine? Western Cape Early Childhood, am I right? Yes. Hello? Lubabalo?
Hello, Chair. It looks like Ms. Nomdo has left the meeting.
Yeah. And then I think that's she was the last one. Am I correct?
I think the last one, Chairperson, should be Center for Early Childhood. Unless they have also left.
Yeah.
Colleagues from Center for Early Childhood. I think Prof. Eric Atmo is still here.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. And so am I, Yusra Ehrenreich. To thank you so much, everyone, for your questions, and to respond to Honourable Ryder's general comment. on the government spending more money in the education space as well as ECD. We echo the comments made by Speaker Russell Wilderman in this regard. And our main concern is how little is being spent on the ECD services, as well as the element of ECD that's being significantly underfunded. As UNICEF SA pointed out, a lot more money goes towards primary health care, immunization, and child grants, but very little, that's 6.5%, goes towards the early learning and the development elements of ECD. And this is seen in the 17 Rand per child per subsidy for centres. We do welcome government's expansion of the subsidy to reach the non-centre-based programs, which is the 6 Rand per child per session. But once again, 6 Rand is not enough to provide a safe environment for a child where they can be fed and they can access age-appropriate and developmental stage-appropriate early learning ECD services. And then with regards to Honourable Joseph and Honourable Peter's comment on the Centre for Early Childhood Development's interaction with the Department of Social Development, I'm going to turn to my director, Professor Eric Atmore, who will be able to provide more information on the centre's engagement with DSD. Thank you.
Chairperson, good afternoon. I can't recall who asked the question, but the question was around the 3.2 million children not in ECD provision. And the person who asked the question got the numbers mixed. There are 1.5 million children in unregulated, unregistered ECD centres. The 3.2 million are children who are not in any form of provision. The question was, have we made representation to the National Department of Social Development? The short answer is yes. And the response has been that we've been totally ignored, despite numerous letters to the minister, to the minister's spokesperson, to the DG, and to the deputy DG. We have not had the courtesy of one single reply. We gathered a 15,000 signature petition, sent that off, and got absolutely no response. So what we extract from this is a distinct lack of interest in early childhood development from the National Department of Social Development. I must say that when we brought litigation against the department on 2 occasions, the department was very efficient and speedy in appointing very expensive legal counsel. So really, we bitterly disappointed that with almost 7 million children under the age of 6, the department has not seen fit, nor has the minister, to respond to civil society at all.
Is that the end?
That's the end. Thank you, Honorable Buthelezi.
Thank you so much. Lubabalo? Lubabalo?
Hello, Chairperson.
This brings us to the end of the responses. Yeah.
That is correct, Chair.
Yeah, that's fine. We do have written submissions which can be made available to the honourable members, and they'll also be reflected on our reports for approval by the respective committees. Honourable members, I think this that issues that we'll be picking up, following up, which have been raised here, so that at least we see some progress with the respective chairs of the finance committees, so that we can see how we respond to some of these things in trying to make our work better and more impactful. I think this is the last meeting that we are having jointly, and I would like to thank you for last meeting this year. I'm not about to die. But thank you very much for the constructive engagement, and wish you well as you deal with your debates And I don't think it's early for me to wish you a very good and safe festive season. Honourable members, I think this takes us to the end of the meeting. The joint sitting of the Select and the Standing Committee on Appropriation is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the contributors and presenters.
Thank you. Honourable Ocampo, why were you so quiet today?
Thank you very
much.
He had a good turn yesterday, Chairperson. He gave a very good speech in the NCOP. You should watch it on YouTube. So I think maybe he's resting his vocal cords.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you as support staff, the secretaries and everybody who have been supporting these committees. Thank you so much.
Thanks to the chairperson.
Bye, Matthew.
Bye, Chairperson.
Cheers.